Chapter 1. The Red King's Choice. There are few moments in the vast tapestry of the Great Crusade more fraught with consequence than those when destiny pauses upon a knife's edge. In the grim annals of the 31st millennium, scholars would mark such moments not by the thunder of bolter fire or the screaming of starship engines, but by the quiet choices made in solitude by those who held the fate of billions in their hands. Yet even the wisest chroniclers could not have foreseen that the salvation of humanity itself would turn upon a single decision made by the most tragic of the Emperor's sons. Magnus the Red, Primarch of the Thousand Suns, the Crimson King of Prospero, sat in the highest tower of his pyramid city of Tisca as the twin suns cast their dying light across the crystalline spires of his homeworld. 4 years had passed since the Council of Nicaea, 4 years since his father had pronounced judgment upon the very powers that defined Magnus's existence. The Edict of Nicaea burned in his mind like a brand, its words as clear and cutting as the day they had been spoken. The pursuit of psychic powers was forbidden. Sorcery was declared maleficarium. The librarius of every legion was to be disbanded. His life's work, his legion's sacred duty to unlock the mysteries of the great ocean, had been condemned as dangerous folly. Yet Magnus endured, for he was a loyal son, and loyalty demanded sacrifice, even when that sacrifice felt like slow death. The meditation chamber around him flickered with subdued light from floating crystal spheres, each one a focus for his contemplation. His single eye, that great crimson orb that had earned him his epithet, gazed not upon the familiar surroundings of his sanctum, but into the swirling currents of the immaterium itself. The warp called to him, as it always had, whispers of knowledge and power that no mere prohibition could silence. Yet he had learned restraint in these long years of exile from his father's favor. Tonight, however, the visions came unbidden and terrible. In the roiling depths of the great ocean, Magnus saw his brother Horus, beloved warmaster, first among equals, lying broken upon an alien blade. The vision blazed with terrible clarity. Davin's moon hung in the void like a festering wound, and upon its surface the Lodge of the Serpent performed their ancient rites. The anathem plunged deep, and with that wound came something far worse than death: corruption. The whispers of gods older than human civilization, voices that promised power at prices the soul could not afford to pay. Magnus watched in mounting horror as his brother's spirit was drawn into the realm of chaos itself, there to be tested, tempted, and ultimately turned. He saw Horus's noble features twist with newfound ambition, his eyes kindle with the fire of rebellion, his heart harden against their father's light. The warmaster would rise from that deathbed, but the Horus who awakened would not be the brother Magnus had known for 2 centuries of conquest. The vision shifted, and Magnus beheld the future that would follow. Brother turned against brother across 1,000 worlds, the fires of civil war consuming the Imperium from within, the Emperor's dream of unity shattered beyond all hope of repair. Legions that had fought side by side for decades, meeting in bitter combat, their unity poisoned by doubt and betrayal, and at the heart of it all, Horus himself leading the charge against terror, seeking to cast down the father who had raised him to greatness. Yet the vision carried more than mere images of destruction. Magnus felt the touch of those same powers that had claimed his brother, the ruinous powers that dwelt in the deep places of the warp. They reached out to him even now, offering their aid in warning the Emperor of the coming treachery. All he need do was embrace their gifts, cast aside the chains of Nicaea's prohibition, and force his way through the psychic barriers that protected Terra. The knowledge could reach his father within the hour, if he but surrendered to the darkness. The temptation blazed through Magnus like wildfire. His legion's fate hung in the balance. The Imperium itself stood upon the precipice of ruin. Surely the urgency of the situation justified any means. Surely his father would understand when the truth was revealed. The voices whispered seductively of necessity, of the greater good, of the terrible cost of hesitation when action was required. Magnus rose from his meditation throne, his great frame trembling with the effort of restraint. The cyclopean eye in his forehead blazed like a star as he wrestled with forces that could have torn apart lesser minds. For long moments he stood there, balanced between salvation and damnation, while around him the crystal spheres pulsed with sympathetic energy. "My lord?" The voice came from the chamber's entrance, soft but carrying clearly through the charged air. Magnus turned to behold Chief Librarian Azek Ahriman, his most trusted son, his greatest student in the mystic arts. The warrior's armor gleamed with the blue and gold of the 1,000 suns, and his psychically attuned features showed concern for his gene father's obvious distress. Behind Ahriman stood Captain Phosis Takar and a handful of other senior librarians, their faces grave with shared worry. "Ahriman," Magnus said, his voice carrying the weight of terrible knowledge. "Brothers, I have seen, I have witnessed what is to come." He spoke then of the vision, of Horus's fall and the civil war that would follow. He described the corruption that even now crept through the War Master's soul, the whispers of chaos that would soon transform the Emperor's favorite son into his greatest enemy. As he spoke, he watched the disbelief and horror play across their faces, watched understanding dawn like a cold sun. "We must warn the Emperor," Phosis Takar said immediately. "If what you have seen is true, then every moment of delay brings us closer to catastrophe." "The means are forbidden to us," Ahriman replied quietly. "The edict of Nicaea was clear. We cannot employ the arts that would allow such a warning to reach Terra with the speed required." "Then we damn ourselves with inaction," Takar's voice cracked with anguish. "Better to break a prohibition than to watch the Imperium burn." The same argument that raged in Takar's voice echoed in Magnus's own soul. Yet as he stood there, feeling the weight of decision settling upon his shoulders like a mantle of lead, another path began to take shape in his mind. A longer path, more treacherous in its way, but one that might preserve both his loyalty to his father and his integrity as a son of the Emperor. "No," Magnus said slowly, the word falling into the chamber's silence like a stone into still water. "There is another way." He moved to the great viewing portal that looked out over Tizca's glittering expanse, his hands clasped behind his back as he gazed upon the city his legion had built. "The Edict of Nicaea forbids the use of sorcery, but it does not prohibit all psychic contact. The Imperium still maintains its network of astropaths, its sanctioned psychers who carry messages between the stars through the Emperor's own blessing." Ahriman's eyes widened with understanding. "A conventional astropathic transmission. But, my lord, such a message would take weeks to reach Terra. And even then, it would be vulnerable to the very corruption that we seek to warn against," Magnus finished. "The ruinous powers watch the astropathic networks, seeking any opportunity to twist words and meanings to their own ends. They would know of our warning before it reached its destination." He turned back to face his sons, and in his single eye burned not the wild fire of desperation, but the steady flame of resolve. "Which is why we must encode our message in such a way that chaos itself cannot unravel it. We must weave truth and warning through layers of meaning so complex that only the Emperor's own magnificent intellect could pass their contents." The task would be monumentally difficult. They would need to craft not merely a message, but a kind of psychic puzzle that could resist corruption while remaining comprehensible to its intended recipient. They would need to embed warnings within warnings, layer meaning upon meaning, until the truth lay hidden like a pearl within an oyster's shell. "It will take time," Ahriman said slowly. "Days, perhaps weeks to craft such a message properly. And even then, transmission through conventional channels will add more weeks to the delay." "Time we may not have," Takar added grimly. Magnus nodded, acknowledging the truth of their concerns. Already he could feel the currents of fate shifting around them, the moment of choice cascading into consequences that would ripple across the galaxy. Yet the alternative path, the quick solution offered by forbidden powers, led only to damnation disguised as salvation. "Then we must hope that our Father's wisdom exceeds our fears," he said quietly. "We will craft this message with all the skill at our disposal. We will encode it so thoroughly that not even the dark gods themselves could corrupt its meaning. And we will trust that the Emperor, in his infinite wisdom, will recognize the truth we send to him." The work began that very night. In the deepest chambers of the Pyramid of Photep, Magnus and his most trusted librarians labored over formulae that would have challenged the greatest minds of the Mechanicum. They wove together principles of psychic resonance and cryptographic theory, creating a kind of memetic encoding that could survive passage through the warp while remaining invisible to those who would corrupt it. Each word was chosen with meticulous care. Each phrase was crafted to carry multiple layers of meaning. The message spoke of expeditions to distant worlds and discoveries of ancient Xenos artifacts, but beneath those surface meanings lay a deeper truth about corruption and treachery, about trusted brothers who could no longer be trusted, about a son's love turning to hate in the darkness between the stars. As the work progressed, Magnus found himself thinking often of his father's face during the Council of Nicaea, of the disappointment that had blazed in those ancient eyes. The Emperor had not acted out of cruelty when he pronounced his judgment upon the Librarius. He had seen some terrible truth about the dangers of uncontrolled psychic power, some future that required the sacrifice of his son's greatest gifts to prevent an even greater catastrophe. Perhaps this was that moment. Perhaps the choice between speed and caution, between the forbidden and the difficult, was itself the test that the Emperor had foreseen. Magnus had spent 4 years in exile learning restraint, learning to master not just his powers but his pride. Now that hard-won wisdom would be put to the ultimate test, the astropathic choir that would carry their message was assembled with equal care. These were not the Legion's battle psychers, but the quiet scholars and communicators who maintained contact with distant expeditions. Each one was briefed on the message's importance without being told its true meaning, for knowledge itself had become a liability in these dark times. When at last the message was complete and ready for transmission, Magnus stood once more in his meditation chamber, watching the twin suns of Prospero set behind the crystal spires of his city. In a few hours, their carefully crafted warning would begin its journey to Terra, traveling by conventional means through the network of astropathic relays that bound the Imperium together. It would arrive too late to prevent Horus's corruption, for that deed was already done. But perhaps, just perhaps, it would arrive in time for the Emperor to prepare for what was coming. Perhaps the War Master's treachery could be met not with surprise and anguish, but with readiness and resolution. Magnus closed his eye and felt the weight of choice settling into certainty. He had chosen the path of patience over the path of power, trust over urgency, wisdom over desperation. Whether that choice would prove to be salvation or catastrophe remained to be seen, but it was made in loyalty and in love, and in hope that his father's vision exceeded even the darkest dreams of chaos. The message began its journey to Terra as Prospero's night descended, carrying with it the fate of an Imperium that did not yet know how desperately it needed the warning hidden in its coded words. Chapter 2. The Emperor's Understanding. In the deepest chambers beneath the Imperial Palace, where the very bedrock of Terra had been carved away to make room for the greatest undertaking in human history, the Master of Mankind sat upon the golden throne and felt the weight of eternity pressing against his consciousness. Here, in the sanctum that no mortal eyes, save those of his most trusted servants, had ever beheld, the Emperor of humanity worked ceaselessly upon the project that would define the future of his species. The golden throne itself was a marvel that transcended the boundaries between technology and sorcery, its crystalline matrices and psychic conductors forming a bridge between the material realm and the roiling chaos of the warp beyond. Through its mechanisms, the Emperor could extend his consciousness into the very fabric of reality itself, shaping the currents of the immaterium to his will and carving pathways through dimensions that lesser minds could not even comprehend. Yet for all its magnificence, the throne was merely a tool in service of a greater vision. Around the Emperor stretched the nascent framework of the Imperial Webway, humanity's answer to the ancient network that had once allowed the Eldar to stride between stars without risk of corruption. Massive pylons of wraithbone and adamantium rose into the vaulted darkness above, their surfaces crawling with geometric patterns that hurt to perceive directly. Between them, shimmering barriers of psychic force held back the predatory entities that dwelt in the deep places of the warp, creatures that would gladly tear apart any mortal soul foolish enough to venture into their domain unprotected. The work had been progressing steadily for decades, each day bringing humanity closer to the moment when they would no longer need to risk their souls upon the tides of the great ocean. Soon, the Emperor believed, his children would walk the safe paths between worlds, protected from the whispers of chaos by barriers that even the dark gods themselves could not breach. Soon, humanity would take the next step in its evolutionary journey, guided by his hand toward a destiny that would eclipse even the greatest achievements of the ancient past. It was in this moment of contemplation that the Emperor felt the subtle shift in the astropathic networks that bound his Imperium together. Like a spider at the center of its web, he was always aware of the messages that flowed between the stars, the constant stream of communication that allowed his vast domain to function as a unified whole. Most such communications were routine affairs, reports from distant expeditions, and requests for reinforcement or supply. But this message was different. The psychic resonance that accompanied it spoke of careful craftsmanship, of layers within layers of meaning that had been woven together with a skill that few minds in the galaxy could match. Even as the message made its way through the conventional channels of the astropathic choir, the Emperor began to decode its hidden meanings, his consciousness passing patterns of symbolism and metaphor that would have remained opaque to any lesser intellect. What he found there stopped even his ancient heart. The message spoke ostensibly of archaeological discoveries on distant worlds, of artifacts uncovered in the ruins of long-dead civilizations. But beneath that surface meaning lay a deeper truth, encoded in mathematical formulae and psychic resonances that only one of his sons possessed the knowledge to craft. Magnus had found a way to warn him of treachery and corruption without violating the letter of the Edict of Nicaea, and the warning itself was more terrible than anything the Emperor had dared to anticipate. Horus, his favored son, The war master upon whom he had bestowed the greatest honor in his gift had fallen to the temptation of the ruinous powers. The message contained detailed descriptions of the corruption that had taken root in the 16th Legion, the subtle whispers and promises that had turned loyalty into rebellion. It spoke of lodges and secret societies, of ancient weapons that carried more than mere physical harm, of a cancer that even now spread through the ranks of the Astartes like poison in a well. Yet as the Emperor absorbed the full scope of the warning, he found himself not with despair, but with something approaching grim satisfaction. For in the deepest chambers of his consciousness, behind barriers of will and psychic might that not even his closest confidants could penetrate, he had always known that this day would come. The Great Crusade had been designed not merely to reunite the scattered remnants of humanity, but to prepare for the storm that would inevitably follow. The Primarchs themselves, for all their nobility and strength, had been created with the knowledge that some among them would fall. The very forces that had scattered them across the galaxy in their infancy had been allowed to succeed, because their failure would serve a greater purpose in the long term. Now that purpose was about to be revealed, the Emperor rose from the golden throne, his movements causing the psychic matrices around him to pulse with sympathetic energy. The barriers holding back the warp flickered momentarily as his attention shifted, then stabilized as automated systems compensated for the momentary lapse. Even a being of his power could not maintain perfect focus upon multiple tasks indefinitely, but the safeguards built into the Webway project had been designed to account for such moments. From the shadows at the chamber's edge stepped a figure whose presence had gone unnoticed until that moment, though he had been standing vigil there for hours uncounted. Malcador the Sigillite, Regent of Terra and the Emperor's most trusted advisor, moved with the quiet dignity that had marked his every action for the millennia of their association. His aged features showed no surprise at the Emperor's sudden movement, for he had learned long ago to read the subtle signs that preceded moments of cosmic significance. "Magnus has sent word," the Emperor said, without preamble, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated through both air and warp in equal measure. Malcador inclined his head slightly, a gesture that acknowledged both the statement and its implications. "The warning we have long anticipated. Yes, Horus has chosen his path, and it leads toward the very abyss we have worked to prevent. The War Master will turn the crusade inward, seeking to destroy all that we have built in pursuit of a throne that was never meant to be occupied by any save myself." The words fell into the chamber's silence, like stones into a deep well, their echoes carrying implications that would reshape the galaxy. Yet neither figure showed surprise or dismay, for this conversation had been planned for decades, its every word rehearsed in preparation for a moment that had always been inevitable. "Then the time has come to accelerate the project," Malcador observed, his tone carrying the weight of decisions that would affect trillions of lives. "Indeed, Magnus has given us a gift more precious than he knows. By choosing patience over urgency, wisdom over power, he has preserved the integrity of our great work while providing us with the time we need to complete it before Horus can mount his rebellion." The Emperor turned back toward the golden throne, but his gaze now encompassed not just the immediate chamber, but the vast network of construction that extended throughout the palace's deepest levels. Thousands of tech adepts and servitors labored in the tunnels beyond, guided by blueprints that had been crafted before the first human cities rose upon Terra's surface. Their work had proceeded according to careful schedules, each phase building upon the last in a sequence that could not be rushed without risking catastrophic failure. Now those schedules would be compressed, not through haste, but through the activation of contingencies that had always been prepared for this moment. "Summon Fabricator General Kelbor Hall," the Emperor commanded, his words carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Tell him that the time for careful preparation has ended. The great work must be completed within the year, regardless of the cost in resources or lives." "And the Primarchs?" Malcador asked quietly. "Those who can be trusted will be brought into our confidence, but carefully and only as circumstances require. Rogel Dawn must begin preparations for the fortification of Terra, though he will not yet understand the full scope of what is coming. Sanguinius should be recalled from the outer reaches of the Crusade, for his presence will be needed in the trials ahead." The Emperor paused, his ancient eyes reflecting depths of sorrow that few living beings would ever be permitted to witness. "As for those who have already chosen their path toward damnation, we will allow them to believe that their treachery goes undetected. When the time comes for them to reveal themselves, they will find that their father was not the fool they believed him to be." Malcador bowed his head in acknowledgement, already calculating the steps that would need to be taken to implement these commands without alerting those whose loyalty had been compromised. The networks of communication and supply that bound the Imperium together would need to be subtly adjusted, routing critical resources toward Terra while maintaining the appearance of normal operations. Trusted agents would need to be activated, their long dormancy ending as they took up positions that would prove crucial in the days to come. "There is one more matter," the Emperor continued, his voice taking on a note that Malcador had learned to associate with the most dire of pronouncements. "When the Webway is complete and the time comes for me to guide humanity's final evolution, someone will need to maintain the barriers that hold chaos at bay. Someone will need to sit upon the golden throne in my place while I walk among our people as their guide and teacher." The implication hung between them like a blade, its edge cutting through decades of unspoken understanding. Malcador had always known that his role in the great work would require sacrifices that few could comprehend, but this moment marked the first time that the ultimate nature of those sacrifices had been stated so clearly. "I understand," the Sigillite said simply, his voice carrying no trace of fear or hesitation. "I know you do, old friend. It is why I have trusted you with truths that I have shared with no other living being. When the moment comes, you will take your place upon the throne, and through your sacrifice, humanity will achieve the destiny that has always been intended for them." The Emperor returned to his seat upon the golden throne, his consciousness already beginning to extend back into the psychic matrices that controlled the Webway's construction. Around him, the great work continued, its pace quickening as new directives flowed through the palace's communication networks. In workshops and foundries throughout the Sol system, the tempo of production increased as resources were diverted toward projects whose true purpose remained hidden from all but the most trusted servants. Yet even as the Emperor immersed himself once more in the delicate task of shaping reality to his will, he found himself thinking of his distant son upon Prospero. Magnus had made a choice that would echo through history, selecting restraint over rashness, patience over power. That choice had preserved not only the integrity of the Webway project, but the possibility of redemption for a son whose loyalty had never truly wavered, despite the pain of exile and prohibition. Perhaps when the great work was complete and humanity had achieved its destined evolution, there would be a place for the Red King in the golden age that was to come. Perhaps the tragic figure of Magnus the Red could yet become Magnus the Redeemed, his knowledge and power finally applied in service of the vision they both shared. But that was a consideration for the future. For now, there was work to be done, and the fate of an entire species hung in the balance. The message from Magnus had been received, decoded, and understood. Now it remained to be seen whether the preparations it had enabled would prove sufficient to weather the storm that was coming. In the depths beneath Terra, the Emperor worked on, and the future of humanity took shape beneath his hands. Chapter 3. The Silent Preparation. In the vast machinery of the Imperium, where the turning of a single gear could affect the fate of 1,000 worlds, the most profound changes often began with the softest whispers. Messages that seemed routine in their phrasing carried within them the seeds of transformation. Orders that appeared to follow established protocols concealed preparations for a war that had not yet been declared, and in the careful orchestration of these seemingly mundane communications, the master of mankind began to prepare his most loyal servants for the storm that Magnus's warning had revealed. The first of these messages departed Terra in the hours following the Emperor's council with Malcador, carried by astropaths whose understanding of their contents extended no further than the surface meanings carefully crafted to conceal deeper purposes. To the watching eyes of potential traitors, these communications appeared to be nothing more than the standard administrative directives that flowed constantly between Terra and the far-flung expeditions of the Great Crusade. Rogel Dawn, Primarch of the Imperial Fists and Master of Siege Warfare beyond compare, received his summons while overseeing the compliance of a stubborn fortress world in the Segmentum Solar. The message spoke of architectural consultations needed for the expansion of the Imperial Palace, of structural assessments required for the accommodation of the growing bureaucratic apparatus that administered the Emperor's domain. To any observer, it was precisely the sort of request that the Praetorian of Terra might expect to receive, given his legion's renowned expertise in fortification and construction. Yet Dawn's keen tactical mind recognized immediately that the message contained layers of meaning that extended far beyond its apparent purpose. The specifications described defensive positions that could only be intended to resist assault from space. The architectural modifications, outlined in careful technical language, were designed not for bureaucratic expansion, but for the accommodation of siege engines and weapon emplacements that could hold Terra against any conceivable enemy. As he read and reread the communication in the privacy of his command chamber, Dawn felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling upon his shoulders. His father was preparing for war, not against some distant Xenos threat or recalcitrant human kingdom, but against enemies who possessed the knowledge and capability to assault Terra itself. The implications of such preparation were staggering in their scope. For what force in the galaxy could threaten the throne world of humanity save the legions Astartes themselves? The Praetorian of Terra set aside his current campaign without hesitation, delegating command to his most trusted captains while he prepared for immediate departure to the Sol system. His legion would follow, their expertise in fortification and siege warfare suddenly transformed from an asset for conquest into a necessity for survival. Whatever threat his father had foreseen, the Imperial Fists would be ready to meet it with the same unyielding determination that had marked their service since the earliest days of the Great Crusade. On distant Baal, Sanguinius of the Blood Angels received a different sort of message, one that spoke of ceremonial duties and the need for his presence at upcoming celebrations marking significant milestones in the Crusade's progress. Yet beneath the formal language of court protocol, the angel detected subtle urgencies that spoke to his preternatural abilities of perception. His father was calling him home, not for celebration, but for preparation. The visions that sometimes plagued his dreams had been growing darker of late, filled with images of brother fighting brother beneath skies stained red with blood. Now those nightmares took on a new and terrible significance. The angel's response was immediate and unquestioning. Within days, The entire 9th Legion was preparing for departure from their current theatre of operations, their sudden withdrawal from a carefully planned campaign explained by the necessity of imperial protocol and the requirements of ceremonial duty. To the watching eyes of potential enemies, it appeared to be nothing more than the sort of administrative reshuffling that occasionally disrupted military operations in service of political necessity. Similar messages reached other loyal Primarchs across the galaxy, each one carefully crafted to match the recipient's personality and current circumstances. Leman Russ received hunting invitations that spoke of prey so dangerous that only the greatest of warriors could hope to bring them to bay. The Khan was offered reports of new worlds discovered beyond the galactic rim, territories so distant and wild that only his legion's mastery of rapid warfare could hope to claim them for the Imperium. Each communication was designed to draw its recipient toward Terra or into positions where their loyalty could be relied upon when the moment of crisis arrived. Yet not every Primarch received such summons. Horus himself, the War Master, whose corruption Magnus had risked everything to reveal, continued to receive the standard communications appropriate to his position. Reports flowed to him from Terra as they always had, keeping him informed of the Imperium's administrative functions and the progress of various ongoing projects. Nothing in these messages suggested that his father suspected the treachery that even now festered in his heart like a cancer. The deception was masterful in its subtlety, requiring the Emperor to maintain the appearance of complete trust in his favored son, while quietly preparing for the inevitable moment of betrayal. Each message to Horus was crafted with meticulous care, revealing nothing of the preparations taking place on Terra, while feeding the War Master precisely the information he would expect to receive. The web of deception was so carefully woven that even Horus's enhanced intellect could detect no trace of suspicion in his father's communications. Meanwhile, on Terra itself, the true scope of the preparations began to manifest as Dawn's response to his father's summons set into motion changes that would transform the throne world into the greatest fortress in human history. The modifications to the Imperial Palace, ostensibly designed to accommodate bureaucratic expansion, revealed their true nature as the Praetorian's keen eye surveyed the proposed construction sites. Here, concealed within what appeared to be ceremonial courtyards, would rise weapon emplacements capable of targeting vessels in low orbit. There, beneath the foundation stones of supposed administrative buildings, would be constructed ammunition bunkers and command centers designed to coordinate the defense of the entire system. Every modification served a dual purpose, maintaining the appearance of peaceful expansion while creating the infrastructure necessary for a siege that could last for years. The Adeptus Custodes, the Emperor's personal guardians who had served at his side since the earliest days of his rule, began to receive reinforcements drawn from their secret training facilities scattered across Terra's surface. To the casual observer, the increased presence of golden-armored warriors within the palace complex appeared to be nothing more than the enhanced security appropriate to times of growing galactic complexity. Yet those who understood the true nature of the Custodes recognized that their numbers were being increased not for ceremonial purposes, but for war. The Silent Sisterhood, those warrior women whose psychic null fields provided protection against the predations of chaos, similarly found their ranks swelled by new recruits drawn from the hidden schools where their kind trained in absolute secrecy. Their presence around the palace increased gradually, their anti-psychic abilities providing an additional layer of defense against enemies whose weapons extended beyond the merely physical into the realm of the warp itself. In the depths beneath the palace, where the great work of the Webway construction continued under the Emperor's direct supervision, the pace of progress accelerated beyond anything previously achieved. The breakthrough that Magnus's warning had enabled manifested not in a single moment of revelation, but in a cascade of technological advances that brought the project to the very threshold of completion. The human-built sections of the network, those tunnels and passages that would connect Terra directly to the ancient Eldar Webway, neared their final integration with the alien architecture they were designed to interface with. Tech adepts worked in shifts that blurred the boundaries between day and night, their augmented forms allowing them to labor without rest in the completion of humanity's greatest undertaking. The Emperor himself spent increasing amounts of time within the nascent network, his consciousness extending through the partially completed pathways to test their structural integrity and psychic resonance. Each test brought new insights, new refinements to the design that would make the finished network more robust and more resistant to the corruption that constantly sought to seep in from the surrounding warp. Yet even as the great work neared completion, the Emperor found himself contemplating the irony of his situation. The warning that had enabled this acceleration had come from Magnus, the son whose pursuit of forbidden knowledge had led to his condemnation at Nicaea. Now that same knowledge, applied with wisdom rather than reckless ambition, had provided the key to humanity's salvation. Perhaps there would indeed be a place for the Red King in the golden age that was to come, assuming that both father and son survived the trials that lay ahead. The changes taking place across the Imperium were subtle in their individual manifestations, but profound in their collective impact. Legion deployments shifted slightly, moving loyal forces into positions where they could respond quickly to threats, while isolating potentially traitorous elements. Supply routes were modified to ensure that crucial resources flowed toward Terra and other key strategic points. Communication networks were quietly restructured to provide additional security for sensitive transmissions. All of these modifications were implemented with the same careful attention to concealment that had marked the Emperor's initial response to Magnus's warning. To the vast majority of the Imperium's citizens, nothing had changed. The Great Crusade continued its inexorable expansion across the galaxy, bringing the light of imperial truth to worlds that had languished in ignorance for millennia. The Primarchs pursued their assigned campaigns with the same dedication that had marked their service since their discovery. Yet beneath this facade of normalcy, the greatest strategic repositioning in human history was taking place. When the moment of crisis finally arrived, when Horus revealed the corruption that had taken root in his heart and raised the banner of rebellion against his father, he would find not a surprised and unprepared Imperium, but one that had been quietly preparing for his treachery for months. The web of loyalty and preparation that the Emperor wove in response to Magnus's warning extended across countless star systems, touching the lives of billions who would never understand the scope of what was being prepared in their name. Yet at its heart remained a simple truth: the Emperor's love for humanity and his determination to see his species achieve the destiny he had always envisioned for them. In the deepest chambers beneath Terra, where the Golden Throne hummed with barely contained energies, and the Webway neared completion, the Emperor continued his work. Around him, the preparations for war proceeded with quiet efficiency, each element falling into place like pieces of a vast puzzle that only he could fully comprehend. The storm was coming, but humanity would be ready to weather it. And when the darkness finally broke over the galaxy, like a tide of blood and betrayal, it would find not victims, but warriors prepared to defend everything they held sacred. The silent preparation was complete. Now there remained only the waiting, and the hope that when the moment of testing arrived, the bonds of loyalty would prove stronger than the whispers of corruption that sought to tear the Imperium apart from within. Chapter 4. The Web Takes Shape. In the depths of creation, where the boundaries between the possible and the impossible grew thin as gossamer, the greatest achievement in human history took its first breath. The moment came not with fanfare or ceremony, but in the quiet hours before terror's dawn, when the only witnesses were the Emperor himself and the humming machinery that had labored for decades to make this instant possible. The final connection had been completed during the previous night's work. As tech adepts, guided by principles they could barely comprehend, had fused the last section of human-wrought tunnel with the ancient Eldar pathway that had waited in dimensional stasis for millennia. The marriage of technologies separated by eons of evolution should have been impossible, yet it had been achieved through the application of knowledge that transcended the limitations of any single species. The Emperor stood before the newly opened portal, its surface shimmering with energies that existed in harmonies beyond the perception of mortal senses. Through the crystalline barrier that separated the material realm from the Webway's interior, he could see the pathway that stretched away into infinity, its walls carved from a substance that was neither matter nor energy, but something that partook of both. Here was the network that had once allowed the Eldar to stride between stars as easily as a man might walk between rooms in his own house. Now, for the first time, that network lay open to human feet. The Emperor's consciousness extended through the portal, testing the psychic resonances that flowed through the Webway's structure like blood through the veins of some vast organism. The ancient Eldar architects had built well, their constructs designed to endure long after their creators had passed into legend. The pathways hummed with protective wards that held back the predatory entities of the warp, creating corridors of safety through dimensions where mortal souls would otherwise be torn apart by forces beyond comprehension. Yet even as he marveled at the elegance of the alien construction, the Emperor detected something that filled him with a satisfaction deeper than mere professional admiration. The human additions to the network had not merely connected to the existing structure, they had enhanced it. The crude matter and primitive technologies of Terra had been transformed by his guidance into something that complemented and strengthened the Eldar Webway, creating hybrid passages that possessed virtues belonging to neither parent technology alone. The moment for the first human transit had arrived. The Emperor stepped forward, his form transitioning from the material realm into the strange non-space of the Webway, with a sensation like passing through the surface of a perfectly still pool. The change was immediate and profound. Here, within the network's protective embrace, the constant pressure of the warp's chaotic energies faded to nothing. The whispers of demons that had plagued human psychers since the species first developed psychic abilities fell silent, replaced by a peace that was almost overwhelming in its completeness. He began to walk, his footsteps echoing through corridors that had known no human presence since their construction. The pathway stretched ahead of him in a perfectly straight line, its walls decorated with geometric patterns that shifted and flowed like living things. Distance became fluid in this place, each step carrying him not merely forward through space, but through the very structure of reality itself. Behind him, the portal that led back to Terra remained visible as a point of golden light, a beacon that marked humanity's first foothold in the network that would carry them to the stars. Yet ahead lay possibilities that staggered even his ancient imagination. Through this single pathway, properly modified and expanded, the entire Imperium could be connected in a web of instantaneous transportation that would make the dangerous journey through the warp unnecessary. The Emperor's consciousness reached out along the network's branching paths, following connections that led to distant star systems across the galaxy. Here was a pathway that emerged near the industrial forges of Mars. There lay another that terminated in the vicinity of Macraga, where Robut Gilliman had built his perfect realm of Ultramar. Each connection offered opportunities that transformed the strategic calculus of galactic governance beyond all previous recognition. Yet as he walked deeper into the network, the Emperor became aware of other presences, ancient intelligences that dwelt within the Webway's structure, like hermit crabs inhabiting abandoned shells. These were not the chaotic entities of the warp, but something far more subtle and dangerous. The Eldar had built their network with safeguards and guardians, automated systems designed to protect the pathways from unauthorized intrusion. Some of these guardians stirred at his passage, their alien consciousness touching his mind with queries formed in languages that predated human civilization. Yet they didn't attack, for the Emperor's presence carried within it something that they recognized and accepted. He had not come as a conqueror seeking to claim territory by force, but as a successor, taking up the burden of stewardship that the Eldar had been forced to abandon. The first transit lasted for precisely 1 hour, measured by Terra's rotation, though time itself seemed to flow differently within the Webway's embrace. When the Emperor finally returned to the material realm, stepping back through the portal into the familiar chambers beneath the Imperial Palace, he carried with him knowledge that would revolutionize humanity's understanding of their place in the galaxy. The implications were staggering in their scope. No longer would human expeditions be forced to risk their souls upon the tides of the warp, gambling with corruption and madness for the simple privilege of traveling between stars. No longer would the Imperium be limited by the treacherous currents of the great ocean, its expansion constrained by the whims of entities that viewed mortal suffering as a source of amusement. Within days of that first successful transit, the Emperor began the careful process of testing the network's capabilities on a larger scale. The first subjects were volunteers from among the Adeptus Custodes, warriors whose psychic resistance and unwavering loyalty made them ideal candidates for experimental journeys into unknown realms. Captain General Constantin Valdor himself led the first squad through the portal, his golden armor gleaming as he stepped from Terra's reality into the impossible spaces of the Webway. The 10 custodians under his command followed without hesitation, their guardian spears held ready for any threat that might emerge from the alien corridors ahead. The journey they undertook was brief in distance, but immense in significance. Following pathways that the Emperor had personally scouted during his initial exploration, the squad traveled from Terra to a terminus point near the edge of the Sol system, emerging through a portal that materialized in the empty space between planets, like a doorway opening onto eternity itself. The transit time was measured in minutes, not months. What would have required weeks of dangerous warp travel was accomplished in less time than it took for Terra to complete a single rotation. When the custodians returned through the same pathway, their reports confirmed what the Emperor had already begun to understand. Humanity had gained access to a technology that would reshape the very foundations of their civilization. Yet even as these early experiments proceeded with encouraging success, the Emperor remained acutely aware of the price that such achievements demanded. The Webway was not merely a transportation network, but a dimensional construct that existed in careful balance with forces that could destroy entire star systems if improperly handled. Every pathway opened required constant maintenance from psychers of extraordinary power. Every journey undertaken risked exposure to guardians and defenses that the Eldar had left behind as protections against exactly the sort of intrusion that humanity was now attempting. The work required to maintain and expand the network would demand sacrifices that few could comprehend. The Emperor himself would need to remain connected to the Golden Throne, his consciousness serving as the linchpin that held the human sections of the Webway in stable existence. Others would need to take up the burden of governing the Imperium in his name, accepting responsibilities that would require them to make decisions about the fate of billions without his direct guidance. Yet these concerns seemed almost trivial when measured against the benefits that successful completion of the project would bring. In the deeper chambers of the palace, where tech adepts labored under the guidance of fabricator General Kelbor Hall himself, new sections of the network took shape with each passing day. The human portions of the Webway grew like crystalline formations, each new tunnel and junction point expanding the possibilities for instantaneous travel across the galaxy. The Mechanicum adepts who worked on these constructions began to understand, perhaps for the first time, the true scope of the endeavor they had been recruited to support. This was not merely another construction project, however advanced its technological requirements might be. This was the foundation for humanity's transformation into something that transcended the limitations that had constrained every previous galactic civilization. As word of these achievements spread through the most trusted circles of the imperial hierarchy, a new sense of purpose began to take root among those who understood the project's true significance. Here was proof that the Emperor's vision extended far beyond the simple conquest of human-settled worlds. Here was evidence that he had always intended for his species to achieve a destiny that would eclipse even the greatest accomplishments of the legendary Eldar Empire. Yet even as these monumental achievements took shape in the depths beneath Terra, darker forces began to stir in the spaces between stars. The ruinous powers, those ancient entities that fed upon the psychic emanations of mortal emotion, had begun to sense the shift in the galaxy's underlying currents. The network that humanity was constructing represented more than a mere technological advancement. It was a direct threat to their dominion over the realm of souls. In the deepest places of the warp, where the Chaos Gods held court among the screaming fragments of civilizations they had destroyed, new plans began to take shape. The human project could not be allowed to succeed, for its completion would sever the connection between the material realm and the great ocean that sustained their existence. Something would need to be done to disrupt the work, to corrupt its purpose, or to destroy it entirely before it could achieve its intended function. The whispers that had claimed Horus on Davin's moon grew stronger, their promises more seductive, and their threats more dire. The War Master's corruption was accelerated, his fall from grace hastened by the urgency of the moment. If the Emperor's great work was to be stopped, it would require the intervention of someone who possessed both the knowledge of its existence and the power to strike at its heart. Yet for now, in the depths beneath the imperial palace, the work continued undisturbed. The Emperor maintained his vigil upon the golden throne, his consciousness stretched across dimensions as he guided the network's growth with the precision of a master craftsman. Around him, the greatest technological achievement in human history took its final shape, preparing to transform not merely the way his species traveled between stars, but the very nature of their existence in the galaxy. The Webway was no longer merely a vision or a distant possibility. It was becoming reality, and with that transformation, the future itself began to shift toward possibilities that would have seemed impossible only months before. The web had taken shape, and through its corridors, humanity would walk toward a destiny that even the gods would fear to challenge. Chapter 5. The War Master's Gambit. The first act of open treachery came not with the thunder of bolter fire or the scream of chains wards, but with silence, a silence so complete and terrible that it seemed to hollow out the very essence of the galaxy, leaving behind a void where once there had been brotherhood and trust. In that silence, the Horus heresy began, not as historians would later record it with fanfare and declaration, but as a whispered murder conducted in the darkness between stars. Horus Lupercal, War Master of the Imperium and first among the Emperor's sons, stood upon the bridge of the vengeful spirit as the fleet under his command took position above the world of Istvan III. Below them turned a planet that had recently been brought into compliance, its population still adjusting to the realities of imperial rule after generations of isolation. To the watching eyes of the ship's crew, this appeared to be nothing more than another routine in operation, a final cleansing action designed to root out the last traces of rebellion from the newly conquered world. Yet Horus knew the truth of what was about to unfold. The bombardment that would rain down upon Istvan III in mere hours would target not the planet's population, but the loyalist elements within his own forces, those space marines whose dedication to their father's vision remained unshakable, whose faith in the imperial truth could not be corrupted by whispered promises of power and glory, would find themselves caught in a storm of virus bombs that would strip the flesh from their bones and leave their gene seed forever tainted. The War Master's features, once noble and inspiring, now bore the subtle marks of the corruption that had taken root in his soul. The scar upon his throat, where Yugan Temba's anathema had nearly claimed his life on Derveen's moon, still ached with phantom pain that reminded him constantly of the moment when he had first heard the voices of the true powers that ruled the galaxy. Those voices whispered to him even now, offering counsel and encouragement as he prepared to take the step from which there could be no return. "The bombardment fleets are in position, my lord," reported Captain Ezekiel Abaddon, his voice carrying the flat tone of a man who had already surrendered his soul to necessity. "All target coordinates have been confirmed. The operation can commence at your command." Horus nodded slowly, his gaze fixed upon the planet that turned beneath them like a sphere of blue and green innocence. How many of his sons would die in the coming hours? How many loyalists would breathe their last breath wondering why their father had abandoned them to such a fate? The questions might have troubled him once, but the voices in his head had taught him to see beyond such sentimental concerns. The galaxy belonged to the strong, and strength required sacrifices that the weak would never understand. "Begin the bombardment," he commanded, his words falling into the bridge's silence like stones into a deep well. The virus bombing of Istvan III commenced with a precision that spoke to months of careful planning. Warheads designed to strip away all organic matter fell like deadly rain upon the surface, their contents spreading through the atmosphere with the efficiency of a plague crafted by gods. Within hours, the planet's biosphere would be transformed into a charnel house where nothing lived save the virulent organisms that fed upon death itself. Yet even as this terrible deed unfolded, other eyes watched from distances measured not in light minutes, but in the span between dimensions themselves. In the depths beneath Terra's surface, the Emperor of mankind sat upon the golden throne and observed the massacre through senses that transcended the limitations of mere physical perception. Through the network of astropathic communication that bound his Imperium together, he felt the death screams of the loyalists who died not knowing that their sacrifice had been anticipated and would not be in vain. The Emperor's features remained impassive as he witnessed the slaughter, yet those who knew him best would have detected the subtle signs of a rage so pure and terrible that it threatened to crack the very foundations of reality. Horus had chosen his path, and in doing so had revealed the extent of the corruption that festered within the ranks of the Astartes. Now the true scope of the treachery could be measured, and the appropriate responses could be implemented with the precision of a master strategist who had been preparing for this moment for months. "It has begun," he said to Malcador, who maintained his silent vigil beside the golden throne. "As we knew it would," the sigillite replied. "The pieces are in motion. Shall we proceed with the extraction protocols?" The Emperor's consciousness reached out through the newly operational Webway network, following pathways that terminated in the vicinity of the Istvan system. The portal that materialized in the space between planets went undetected by Horus's fleet, its dimensional signature masked by the psychic interference generated by the virus bombing itself. Through that gateway came salvation for those loyalists who might otherwise have died unknown and unmourned. The extraction force that emerged from the Webway consisted of a carefully selected company of custodians, their golden armor modified with the advanced technologies that the Emperor's researchers had recently made available. These were not merely the guardians who had protected the Imperial Palace for generations, but something new and terrible. Warriors who could strike anywhere in the galaxy without warning, appearing through dimensional portals to rescue the innocent or destroy the guilty as the situation demanded. Captain General Konstantin Valdor led the force personally, his guardian spear crackling with energies that existed in harmonies between the material and immaterial realms. The orders he carried were simple in their conception, but staggering in their implications. Locate and extract every loyalist space marine on Istvan III's surface, regardless of the opposition that such an action might provoke. The mission was accomplished with an efficiency that bordered on the miraculous. Loyalists who had prepared to make their final stand against impossible odds found themselves suddenly surrounded not by enemies, but by golden-armored figures who spoke of rescue and redemption. Companies that had been marked for death discovered that their emperor had not abandoned them, that their loyalty had been noted and would be rewarded with salvation. The extraction proceeded under cover of the chaos and confusion generated by the virus bombing itself. By the time Horus's forces realized that something had gone wrong, that their carefully planned massacre had somehow been disrupted, the loyalist survivors were already beyond their reach. The Webway portals closed without trace, leaving behind only empty battlefields where living warriors should have died. When reports of the failed purge reached the War Master, his reaction was swift and terrible. The corruption that had claimed his soul blazed forth in a fury that sent lesser beings cowering in fear. Yet beneath that rage lay a cold understanding that chilled him more than any emotion could have done. Someone had known. Someone had anticipated his move and prepared countermeasures that should have been impossible to implement. "How many?" he demanded of the fleet commanders who brought him news of the disaster. "Difficult to say with certainty, my lord," replied Captain Loken, his features pale with shock at what he had witnessed. "Perhaps half of the loyalist forces that were targeted for elimination. They simply vanished during the bombardment, as if they had never been there at all." Horus turned his gaze toward the distant star that marked Terra's location in the galaxy, and for the first time since his corruption had begun, he felt the cold touch of genuine fear. If his father had somehow learned of the planned betrayal in advance, if the master of mankind had been preparing for this moment while maintaining the pretense of ignorance, then the rebellion that Horus had believed would catch the Imperium by surprise might instead find itself facing an enemy that had been ready for war from the very beginning. On Terra itself, the Emperor wasted no time in implementing the next phase of his response to Horus's treachery. The loyalist Primarchs, who had been quietly recalled to the vicinity of the Sol system, found themselves summoned to a gathering that would forever change their understanding of their place in the galaxy. In a chamber deep within the Imperial Palace, where the very walls hummed with psychic energy and the air itself seemed charged with potential, the truth was finally revealed. Rogel Dawn was the first to arrive, his expression grim as he took in the chamber's unusual configuration. The room had been arranged not for ceremony or comfort, but for the presentation of evidence that would require careful examination and analysis. Picked captures and data feeds surrounded a central table where a three-dimensional projection showed the Istvan system in perfect detail. Sanguinius arrived moments later, the angel's features bearing the weight of visions that had grown increasingly dark in recent weeks. Behind him came the other loyal sons who had answered their father's summons: Ferrus Manus of the Iron Hands, Vulcan of the Salamanders, and Corax of the Raven Guard. Each Primarch carried himself with the bearing of a warrior who sensed that momentous events were about to unfold. "My sons," the Emperor began, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated through both sound and psychic space, "the time has come for you to understand the true nature of the war that now begins." He gestured toward the projection, and the image shifted to show the virus bombing of Istvan III in horrifying detail. The Primarchs watched in stunned silence as evidence of Horus's betrayal unfolded before their eyes. The data feeds, showing not merely the massacre itself, but the careful planning that had preceded it. "Horus has chosen his path," the Emperor continued, "and in doing so, has revealed the extent of the corruption that threatens everything we have built. This is not merely a rebellion against imperial authority, but a war for the very soul of humanity itself." The silence that followed was broken by Ferrus Manus, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "How long have you known?" "Since before the first shot was fired," the Emperor replied. "Magnus sent warning of what was to come, and we have been preparing for this moment ever since. The extraction of loyalist forces from Istvan III was merely the first demonstration of the capabilities we have developed in anticipation of this conflict." He gestured again, and the projection shifted to show the Webway network that now connected Terra to strategic points across the galaxy. The Primarchs stared in amazement as the scope of their father's preparation became clear, understanding dawning in their eyes as they realized the implications of what they were seeing. "The Great Crusade was always intended to prepare for this moment," the Emperor explained. "Every conquest, every compliance, every alliance forged has been designed with the knowledge that someday we would face enemies who carried the corruption of chaos in their hearts. Now that day has arrived, and we are ready to meet it." Sanguinius stepped forward, his noble features reflecting both sorrow and determination. "What would you have us do, Father?" "Return to your legions and prepare for war, but not the war that our enemies expect us to fight. Through the network you have seen, we can strike anywhere in the galaxy without warning. We can reinforce besieged worlds in minutes rather than months. We can turn the very advantages that our enemies believe they possess against them." The gathering continued through the long hours of Terra's night, as strategies were planned and responsibilities assigned. When the loyal Primarchs finally departed to rejoin their forces, they carried with them not merely orders for the coming campaign, but a renewed understanding of their father's vision for humanity's future. The War Master's gambit had failed in its primary objective, but it had succeeded in revealing the true nature of the conflict that would define the next phase of human history. No longer was this a simple civil war between competing factions within the Imperium. It had become a struggle between the forces of order and chaos themselves, with the fate of an entire species hanging in the balance. Yet for the first time since Magnus's warning had reached Terra, the Emperor felt something approaching optimism. The enemy had revealed themselves, the loyal forces had been preserved, and the great work that would secure humanity's future was nearing completion. The war had begun, but it would not unfold as the ruinous powers had planned. Chapter 6. The Golden Path opens. The moment that would transform the destiny of humanity came not with the thunder of artillery or the roar of starship engines, but with the gentle hum of machinery that had labored for decades to achieve perfection. In the deepest chambers beneath the imperial palace, where the golden throne stood as both altar and engine of transformation, the Emperor of mankind placed his hands upon controls that would reshape the very foundations of galactic civilization. The Webway project was complete. Around him stretched the culmination of humanity's greatest undertaking, a network of crystalline tunnels and psychic conduits that connected Terra not merely to the ancient Eldar pathways between stars, but to a destiny that transcended anything the galaxy had known since the war in heaven itself. Every junction had been tested, every pathway had been secured, every safeguard had been implemented to ensure that what was about to unfold would proceed without the catastrophic failures that had destroyed lesser civilizations. The Emperor rose from the golden throne for the first time in months, his movement sending ripples of psychic energy through the network that stretched across dimensions. Yet the throne did not fall silent in his absence, for the systems that maintained the Webway's integrity had been designed to function independently of any single consciousness, no matter how powerful. This was humanity's achievement, not merely his own, and it would endure long after even his ancient existence had passed into legend. Malkador stood beside the primary control matrix, his aged features reflecting the satisfaction of a plan that had required centuries of preparation finally coming to fruition. "The loyal Primarchs await your summons," he said quietly. "Shall we begin the final revelation?" The Emperor nodded, his consciousness already reaching out through the palace's communication networks to touch the minds of his most trusted sons. The message he sent carried within it harmonics of such profound significance that even the Primarchs, with their enhanced psychic resistance, felt the weight of cosmic importance settling upon them like a mantle of stars. They came swiftly, these greatest of his creations, their footsteps echoing through corridors that had never before witnessed such a gathering. Rogel Dawn arrived first, his expression bearing the focused intensity that marked him as the master of defensive warfare. Sanguinius followed, the angel's noble features reflecting both anticipation and the weight of visions that had shown him glimpses of what was to come. Behind them came the others, Ferrus Manus, his mechanical hands gleaming in the chamber's crystalline light, Vulcan, his massive frame radiating the warmth and strength that had made him beloved by his legion, Corax, moving with the Shadow Walker's grace that had earned him his epithet. Each Primarch represented not merely a military asset, but a facet of humanity's potential, given form and purpose. When all had assembled in the chamber that housed the network's primary nexus, the Emperor spoke words that would echo through history like the tolling of a great bell. "My sons, the work of ages is complete. Today, humanity takes its first step upon the golden path that will carry our species beyond the reach of the powers that have sought to corrupt and destroy us since the dawn of consciousness itself." He gestured toward the control matrix, and the chamber filled with a soft radiance that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. Through the crystalline barriers that surrounded them, the Primarchs could see the network stretching away into infinity, its pathways glowing with energies that existed in harmonies between the material and immaterial realms. "Behold the Imperial Webway," the Emperor continued, his voice carrying overtones that resonated through dimensions beyond the merely physical. "Through these pathways, humanity will travel between stars without risk of corruption. Through these corridors, we will carry the light of civilization to every corner of the galaxy. And through these protected spaces, our species will achieve the psychic evolution that has always been intended for us." Dawn was the first to speak, his tactical mind immediately grasping the implications of what he witnessed. The strategic advantages alone would revolutionize our approach to warfare. Supply lines that cannot be interdicted, reinforcements that can arrive without warning, the ability to strike at any point in the galaxy with perfect coordination. These are indeed significant benefits, the Emperor agreed, but they are merely the foundation for something far greater. The Webway is not simply a transportation network, but a sanctuary where humanity can develop its psychic potential without the constant threat of demonic corruption that has plagued our species since its first tentative steps into the realm of consciousness. Sanguinius stepped forward, his prescient abilities allowing him to perceive truths that remained hidden from his brothers. You speak of evolution, Father. What manner of transformation do you foresee for our kind? The Emperor's ancient eyes reflected depths of knowledge that spanned millennia of preparation and planning. Within the protected embrace of the Webway, freed from the need to risk our souls upon the tides of the warp, humanity will achieve its destined form. We will become a fully psychic species, our minds linked in harmony, rather than divided by the barriers that have always separated conscious beings from one another. The implications of such a transformation staggered even the enhanced minds of the Primarchs, a humanity united not merely by law and custom, but by the very fabric of consciousness itself, a species capable of coordinated action on a scale that would make their current achievements seem like the fumbling attempts of children, the power to reshape reality itself through focused will and unified purpose. The process has already begun, the Emperor explained, moving toward another section of the control matrix. In the deepest chambers of the network, volunteers from among the most psychically gifted members of our species have commenced the first stages of guided evolution. Their experiences will inform the protocols we develop for the broader population. As he spoke, the chamber's displays shifted to show images of these early participants in humanity's transformation, men and women whose psychic abilities had been enhanced and refined through careful exposure to the Webway's energies. Their consciousness expanded beyond the limitations that had previously constrained human development. They moved through the network's corridors like beings of living light, their thoughts interconnected in webs of understanding that transcended anything the galaxy had previously witnessed. Yet even as these miraculous images filled the chamber, another presence made itself felt in the depths of the warp. The Chaos Gods, those ancient entities that had fed upon mortal suffering since the first conscious beings had learned to fear death, suddenly understood the true scope of the threat that humanity represented. This was not merely another rebellious species seeking to escape their influence, but a coordinated attempt to sever the connection between the material realm and the realm of souls that sustained their existence. In the deepest places of the immaterium, where the boundaries between thought and reality dissolved into screaming chaos, 4 voices rose in a harmony of fury that shook the very foundations of the warp itself. Khorne's rage blazed like a star gone supernova, his bloodthirsty nature offended by the prospect of a universe where conflict might be resolved through understanding rather than violence. Tzeentch's cunning turned toward plans of such complexity that even he could not fully comprehend their implications, seeking ways to corrupt or destroy the network before it could achieve its intended purpose. Nurgle's despair deepened as he contemplated a future where disease and decay might be banished through the application of pure psychic energy. Slanesh's appetites grew sharper and more desperate as the possibility of eternal sensation and experience began to slip beyond reach. Together, they represented a threat to human progress that transcended anything the species had previously faced. Yet their fury only served to validate the necessity of the Emperor's great work. For too long, humanity had been forced to accept the dominion of beings whose very existence depended upon mortal suffering and spiritual corruption. Now, for the first time in galactic history, there existed a path beyond their reach, a way for conscious life to develop and flourish without feeding the endless hunger of the warp's inhabitants. "The enemy will not accept this development without resistance," the Emperor warned his assembled sons. "Even now, they seek ways to corrupt our achievement, to turn our greatest triumph into another source of damnation. We must be prepared for assaults that will test every safeguard we have implemented." Ferrus Manus stepped forward, his enhanced physiology already adapting to the psychic energies that flowed through the chamber. "What would you have us do, Father? How shall we defend this miraculous achievement?" "Return to your legions and begin the process of integration," the Emperor commanded. "Your warriors must learn to fight within the Webway itself, to defend its passages against enemies that exist in dimensions beyond the merely physical. The network will allow us to deploy forces anywhere in the galaxy, but only if we can maintain its integrity against the powers that seek to destroy it." The Primarchs received their orders with the same dedication that had marked their service since the Great Crusade's inception. Yet there was something different in their bearing now. They had been given a glimpse of humanity's ultimate destiny, and that vision transformed their understanding of their role in the galaxy's future. They were no longer merely conquerors bringing compliance to scattered human worlds, but guardians of a transformation that would elevate their species beyond anything previously achieved. As the gathering concluded, and the Primarchs departed to implement their father's commands, the Emperor returned his attention to the network that now connected Terra to strategic points across the galaxy. Through its pathways, the first mass deployments of Imperial forces were already beginning, companies of Space Marines and regiments of Imperial Army moving between stars in minutes rather than months. The tactical advantages were immediately apparent. Worlds that had been preparing to declare for Horus found themselves facing reinforcements that should have been impossible to deploy. Supply lines that the traitor forces had believed secure suddenly came under assault from enemies who appeared without warning and vanished just as quickly. The very foundations of conventional interstellar warfare began to crumble as the Loyalists demonstrated capabilities that seemed to violate the basic laws of physics. Yet these military applications, significant as they were, represented only the beginning of the transformation that the Webway would enable. In the protected chambers where humanity's psychic evolution continued under careful guidance, developments proceeded at a pace that astounded even the Emperor's ancient expectations. The volunteers who participated in the early stages of the process emerged with abilities that transcended anything previously recorded in human history. They could perceive the emotional states of beings across vast distances, their empathic abilities enhanced to the point where deception became impossible in their presence. They could manipulate matter at the molecular level through focused will, creating tools and weapons from base elements with an efficiency that surpassed even the most advanced manufacturing techniques. Most significantly, they could link their consciousness with others of their kind, creating collective intelligences that possessed problem-solving capabilities far beyond what any individual mind could achieve. These achievements represented only the first tentative steps upon a path that would ultimately lead to humanity's transcendence of the limitations that had constrained conscious life since the galaxy's formation. The Emperor had always known that his species possessed the potential for such transformation, but the Webway provided the protected environment necessary for that potential to be realized without the constant threat of corruption that had destroyed so many previous attempts at psychic evolution. The golden path was open, and humanity had begun the journey toward a destiny that would reshape the very nature of galactic civilization. Yet the war for the right to complete that journey had only just begun, and the forces arrayed against them possessed power and cunning that had been refined across eons of experience in corruption and destruction. The next phase of the conflict would determine whether humanity's greatest achievement would survive to fulfill its intended purpose, or whether it would join the countless other failed attempts to escape the dominion of chaos that littered the galaxy's history like monuments to broken dreams. But for this moment, in the depths beneath Terra where the network's heart beat with the rhythm of possibility itself, there was only the quiet satisfaction of a plan, generations in the making finally coming to fruition. The golden path was open, and the future had begun. Chapter 7. The Siege of Deception. The fleet that translated into the Sol system carried within its hulls the concentrated fury of half the galaxy, yet its arrival brought not the shock of surprise that its commander had anticipated, but the cold realization that even the best-laid plans could be turned against those who conceived them. Horus Lupercal, the fallen war master, stood upon the bridge of the vengeful spirit and gazed upon the throne world of humanity with eyes that had expected to find weakness, vulnerability, and the chaos of unpreparedness. Instead, Terra blazed before him like a star of war given form and purpose. The orbital defenses that should have been caught off guard by his sudden appearance were fully manned and operational, their weapon batteries tracking his fleet with a precision that spoke of months of preparation rather than hasty mobilization. The void between planets crawled with defensive formations that had been positioned not in response to his arrival, but in anticipation of it. Monitor ships and battle stations hung in the darkness like predators waiting for prey, foolish enough to venture within range of their guns. Impossible, breathed Ezekiel Abaddon from his position beside the War Master's command throne. Our intelligence indicated that the majority of loyal forces were scattered across the outer reaches of the Crusade. Terra should be defended by little more than garrison forces and the palace guard. Horus said nothing, his enhanced senses already passing the tactical situation with the keen intellect that had made him the Emperor's chosen successor. The formations arrayed against him were not merely defensive in nature, but possessed a coordination and strategic depth that suggested the presence of his most capable brothers. There, amid the gleaming hulls of the Imperial Fist's fleet, he could detect the tactical signatures that marked Rogel Dawn's handiwork. Beyond them, the graceful vessels of the Blood Angels moved in formations that could only have been choreographed by Sanguinius himself. Yet it was not merely the presence of these forces that chilled the War Master's corrupted heart, but their positioning. Every ship, every defensive platform, every orbital installation had been placed with mathematical precision to create interlocking fields of fire that would turn any assault into a grinding meat grinder of attrition. This was not the hasty preparation of a garrison caught by surprise, but the methodical implementation of a defensive strategy that could only have been months in the planning. The terrible truth began to dawn upon him with the inevitability of a rising sun. His father had known. The Emperor of mankind, the being he had planned to catch, unprepared and vulnerable, had been anticipating this moment since before the first shots of the rebellion had been fired. The carefully orchestrated campaign that Horus had believed would culminate in the seizure of Terra had instead become an elaborate trap, with himself as the intended victim. "Signal the fleet," Horus commanded, his voice carrying harmonics of rage and betrayal that made lesser beings flinch away from his presence. "All vessels are to advance to assault positions. If our father wishes to play games of deception, then we shall teach him the price of such arrogance." The order was transmitted across the rebel fleet, and hundreds of warships began their inexorable advance toward the inner system. Yet even as they moved with the coordination that marked them as veterans of 100 campaigns, their commanders could not shake the growing sense that they were sailing into the very jaws of destruction. The defensive formations that opposed them moved with a unity of purpose that transcended anything they had previously encountered, their tactical responses anticipating and countering rebel maneuvers with an efficiency that bordered on the prescient. It was then that the true scope of the Emperor's preparation revealed itself. From points in space that should have been empty void, shimmering portals began to materialize like tears in the fabric of reality itself. Through these dimensional gateways came reinforcements that should have been impossible to deploy. Battle groups that materialized without warning in positions that placed them perfectly to exploit weaknesses in the rebel formation. Entire companies of Space Marines emerged from the portals fully armed and ready for battle, their deployment coordinated with a precision that made conventional void warfare seem clumsy and predictable by comparison. Horus watched in growing dismay as his carefully planned assault began to unravel before it had truly begun. Squadrons of rebel ships found themselves surrounded by enemies that had appeared without warning, their formations disrupted by attacks that came from directions that should have been secure. The advantage of surprise that he had counted upon had been turned against him, transforming his forces from hunters into the hunted. "Withdraw the advance squadrons," he ordered, his tactical mind already calculating the scope of the disaster that was unfolding. "Reform the fleet at maximum engagement range. We need time to assess the nature of these capabilities our enemies have demonstrated." Yet even as his forces began to pull back from the killing zone they had inadvertently entered, the Emperor's response demonstrated that withdrawal would provide no more safety than advance had offered. The portals that had disgorged defensive reinforcements now began to manifest directly within the rebel formation itself, their appearance heralded by the distinctive energy signatures that marked the activation of technologies beyond conventional imperial science. Through these gateways came not the massive battle barges and strike cruisers that would have been expected in conventional warfare, but smaller craft that moved with the precision of surgical instruments. Boarding torpedoes emerged from dimensional space to strike at the most vulnerable sections of rebel vessels, their assault teams materializing aboard enemy ships before defensive measures could be implemented. Fighter squadrons appeared in the midst of rebel formations like vengeful spirits, their pilots demonstrating a coordination that could only have been achieved through technologies that allowed instantaneous communication across impossible distances. The battle that followed was unlike anything in the recorded history of void warfare. Traditional concepts of range and positioning became meaningless when the enemy could appear anywhere without warning, their attacks coming from directions that existed outside conventional three-dimensional space. Rebel commanders found themselves fighting not merely against superior numbers, but against tactical principles that seemed to violate the basic laws of physics. Admiral Temba, commanding a squadron of rebel cruisers that had become isolated during the opening phases of the engagement, transmitted a desperate request for clarification as his vessels came under assault from enemies that seemed to materialize from nowhere. "War Master, we are under attack by forces that appear to be using some form of teleportation technology. Our auguries cannot predict their movements, and our defensive formations are being systematically dismantled. Request immediate support or permission to withdraw." Horus studied the tactical displays that showed the systematic destruction of his advance forces, his enhanced intellect finally grasping the full scope of what he was witnessing. This was not merely superior technology or tactical coordination, but something that transcended the boundaries of conventional warfare entirely. His father had gained access to capabilities that allowed Imperial forces to treat the void itself as a medium for instantaneous transportation and deployment. The implications were staggering in their scope. If the Emperor could deploy forces anywhere in the galaxy without the delays and vulnerabilities associated with warp travel, then the strategic calculus that had guided the rebellion from its inception had been fundamentally flawed. Every plan that depended upon the rebels' ability to strike at isolated Imperial forces before reinforcements could arrive would need to be reconsidered. Every assumption about the time required for the Loyalists to coordinate their response would prove to be worthless. "All ships are to withdraw to the outer system," Horus commanded, his voice carrying the bitter taste of defeat even as he spoke the words. "We will observe and assess these new capabilities before committing to further engagement." Yet even as the rebel fleet began its withdrawal, the Emperor's forces demonstrated that retreat would provide no sanctuary from their reach. The same portals that had deployed reinforcements to defend Terra now began to manifest throughout the outer system, their appearance marking the arrival of pursuit forces that moved with the relentless efficiency of predators following wounded prey. The withdrawing rebel vessels found themselves harassed by enemies that could appear ahead of them, despite having started the pursuit from positions well behind. Supply convoys that should have been safely beyond the reach of Imperial forces discovered that distance provided no protection against enemies who could travel between stars in the time it took for a heart to beat. The very concept of a secure rear area became meaningless when the enemy possessed the ability to strike anywhere without warning. It was during this chaotic withdrawal that Horus finally understood the true nature of the trap into which he had led his forces. This was not merely a defensive victory achieved through superior preparation, but a fundamental transformation of the strategic balance that governed interstellar warfare. His father had not simply anticipated the rebellion and prepared to defend against it, but had developed capabilities that made conventional military campaigns obsolete. The communication that reached him from the vengeful spirit's Vox array came not through the conventional channels of military transmission, but through means that bypassed his ship's defenses entirely. The voice that spoke was one he had known since his earliest memories, carrying harmonics of authority and disappointment that cut through his corrupted soul like a blade forged from starlight itself. "My son," the Emperor's words resonated through the bridge's atmosphere with a presence that seemed to make the very air itself heavy with significance. "Did you truly believe that your treachery could escape my notice? That the corruption which has claimed your soul could remain hidden from one who has guided humanity's development since its earliest steps into consciousness?" The bridge fell silent, as every soul present felt the weight of judgment descending upon them like the pressure of an ocean. Horus found himself unable to respond immediately, the words he might have spoken dying in his throat as he confronted the reality of his father's omniscience. "I had hoped," the Emperor continued, "that when this moment arrived, you would choose differently, that the nobility which once defined your character would prove stronger than the whispers of entities whose existence depends upon the suffering of others. Yet you have chosen your path, and in doing so have revealed the full scope of the corruption that threatens everything we have built." Horus finally found his voice, though it emerged as little more than a whisper freighted with all the rage and betrayal that had driven him to this moment. "You speak of choice, Father. Yet you made that choice for all of us when you abandoned the Great Crusade to pursue your secret projects. We were your sons, your generals, your chosen instruments of conquest, yet you cast us aside without explanation or consideration." "I cast aside nothing," the Emperor replied, his tone carrying notes of sadness that seemed to encompass the tragedy of entire civilizations. Every preparation I made, every project I pursued, every moment I spent in apparent isolation was dedicated to securing a future worthy of humanity's potential. The work that has allowed us to meet your rebellion with such effectiveness was undertaken not for my own glorification, but for the preservation of everything we hold sacred. The exchange that followed was witnessed by crews throughout both fleets, their Vox arrays somehow receiving the transmission despite operating on entirely different frequencies. It was a conversation between father and son, between creator and created, between the embodiment of humanity's highest aspirations and the manifestation of its greatest failure. Yet it was also something more, a demonstration of power that transcended the merely military. The Emperor was not simply communicating across the void, but projecting his presence through means that made conventional defensive measures meaningless. If he could reach into the heart of the rebel fleet to deliver a message, what else might he be capable of achieving through the same means? When the transmission finally ended, leaving behind only the hollow silence of the void, Horus understood that the war he had planned to fight no longer existed. The Emperor had not merely prepared to defend against rebellion, but had transformed the very nature of warfare itself. The siege of terror that should have been his moment of ultimate triumph had instead become a demonstration of his own obsolescence. The War Master's fleet withdrew to the edges of the Sol system, its formation ragged and demoralized by an engagement that had lasted less than a day, yet had shattered every assumption upon which the rebellion had been based. Behind them, terror continued to shine like a beacon of defiance, its defenses now revealed not as desperate fortifications hastily erected against surprise attack, but as the visible manifestation of preparation that had been decades in the making. The siege of deception was over before it had truly begun, and the real war for humanity's future was about to commence. Chapter 8. The Crimson King's Redemption. The portal that opened in the deepest chambers of the Imperial Palace carried within its shimmering depths more than mere reinforcements for the siege that raged in the void above terror. It bore the weight of redemption itself, a possibility that had seemed lost since the day the Council of Nicaea had pronounced judgment upon the pursuit of psychic knowledge. Through that dimensional gateway came a figure whose presence would transform the very nature of the conflict that threatened to tear the galaxy apart. Magnus the Red, the Crimson King of Prospero, stepped through the Webway portal not as the demon-touched traitor that the Chaos Gods had sought to create, but as a son returning home after years of exile and suffering. His massive frame bore the marks of tribulation that had refined his spirit like precious metal in a forge, yet his single eye blazed not with the fire of corruption, but with the pure flame of purpose renewed. Behind him came the surviving members of his legion, those 1,000 sons whose loyalty to their Primarch had been matched only by their dedication to the Emperor's vision of human advancement. They moved with the precise discipline that had always marked their brotherhood, their blue and gold armor gleaming in the chamber's crystalline light. Yet there was something different about them now, a sense of hard-won wisdom that spoke to trials endured and lessons learned through suffering. The Emperor rose from the golden throne as his wayward son approached, his ancient features reflecting emotions too complex for lesser beings to comprehend. Here was the child of his creation who had possessed the greatest potential for psychic development among all the Primarchs, yet whose pursuit of that potential had led to condemnation and exile. The reunion that unfolded in the chamber's hallowed silence would determine whether that exile had brought wisdom or merely deepened the wounds that separation had inflicted. "Father," Magnus said, his voice carrying harmonics of humility that would have been impossible to detect in his words before the Council of Nicaea. I have come to offer my service in humanity's darkest hour, if you will have me. The Emperor studied his son with senses that penetrated beyond the merely physical, perceiving the changes that years of restraint and reflection had wrought upon Magnus's psychic architecture. The pride that had once driven the Red King to exceed every boundary and prohibition had been tempered by the bitter understanding of consequences. The reckless ambition that had nearly destroyed everything the Emperor had worked to build had been replaced by a careful wisdom that recognized the difference between knowledge pursued for its own sake and power wielded in service of a greater purpose. You sent warning when it would have been easier to remain silent, the Emperor said quietly. You chose patience over urgency, wisdom over power. These choices have made all that we have accomplished possible. Magnus bowed his head, the weight of his father's words settling upon him like a benediction that he had never dared to hope he might receive. I have learned much in my exile, father. The pursuit of knowledge without understanding of its consequences is not wisdom, but folly. The power that serves only itself is no power at all, merely another form of slavery disguised as freedom. The Emperor descended from the throne, his movement sending ripples of energy through the chamber's psychic matrices. When he reached Magnus, he placed a hand upon his son's shoulder, in a gesture that carried within it the forgiveness that both had thought might be forever impossible. "Welcome home, my son," he said, and in those words lay the restoration of bonds that had seemed broken beyond all hope of repair. Yet even as this reunion unfolded, the siege that raged in the space above Terra demanded immediate attention. The Chaos Gods, denied the corruption of Magnus that had been central to their plans, had begun to deploy assets of a different and more terrible nature. Demonic entities were attempting to manifest within the Sol system itself, their incursions facilitated by the psychic turmoil generated by the ongoing battle between brother and brother. It was here that Magnus's knowledge proved invaluable beyond anything his father had anticipated. The Red King's understanding of the warp's deeper mysteries, refined by years of careful study rather than reckless experimentation, allowed him to perceive the nature of the demonic assault with a clarity that even the Emperor's enhanced senses could not match. "They seek to corrupt the Webway itself," Magnus observed, his consciousness extending through the network's pathways to assess the scope of the threat. The assault upon Terra is merely a distraction. Their true objective is to establish permanent beachheads within the dimensional corridors that would allow them to strike at any point in the galaxy without warning. The Emperor's expression grew grim as he absorbed the implications of this intelligence. If the Chaos Gods succeeded in corrupting even a portion of the Webway network, the advantage that had allowed Terra to withstand Horus's assault would be transformed into a liability that could destroy the Imperium from within. "Can the incursions be prevented?" he asked. Magnus extended his psychic awareness deeper into the network, his enhanced perceptions following currents of energy that existed in dimensions beyond normal space. What he found there filled him with a cold understanding of the scope of the challenge they faced. "The demons are not entering through conventional breaches in reality," he reported. "They are manifesting directly within the Webway's structure, using sympathetic resonances created by the psychic trauma of the Civil War itself. Every death in this conflict feeds their ability to corrupt the pathways." The solution that Magnus proposed required a coordination of psychic power that had never before been attempted in human history. The Emperor would maintain his position upon the Golden Throne, his consciousness serving as the primary anchor that held the Webway's human sections in stable existence. Magnus would take command of the network's defenses, using his deep understanding of both chaos sorcery and protective warding to create barriers that the demons could not penetrate. Yet even as they began to implement this strategy, the true scope of the Chaos God's desperation revealed itself. A manifestation began to take shape within the chamber itself, its form coalescing from the psychic energies that permeated the space around the Golden Throne. This was not merely another demon seeking to establish a foothold in reality, but something far more personal, and therefore infinitely more dangerous. The figure that emerged from the swirling energies bore Magnus's own face, yet corrupted and twisted into something that reflected all the dark potential that the Red King's fall to chaos might have unleashed. This demon self moved with malevolent grace, its single eye blazing with fires that had never known the restraint of wisdom or the guidance of love. "Behold what you could have been," the demon Magnus spoke, its voice carrying echoes of power that transcended the merely physical. "Behold the glory that your father's prohibitions have denied you. Join with me, and together we shall claim the knowledge that is rightfully ours, regardless of the cost in lesser lives." The psychic battle that followed was fought not merely between two beings, but between two possible futures for humanity itself. The demon represented the path of unlimited ambition, where power was pursued without regard for consequence, and knowledge was sought without consideration of wisdom. Magnus embodied the harder path of restraint and service, where abilities were employed not for their own sake, but in dedication to purposes greater than the self. The conflict raged across multiple dimensions simultaneously, its effects rippling through the Webway network as competing visions of reality clashed with forces that threatened to tear apart the very foundations of existence. Yet Magnus fought not alone, but with the support of his father's presence and the accumulated understanding that years of reflection had granted him. The demon self wielded sorceries that could have shattered planets and rewritten the fundamental laws of physics. Yet these very excesses proved to be its weakness. Power without purpose consumed itself. Knowledge without wisdom became its own contradiction. Magnus met each assault not with equivalent force, but with precise applications of ability, guided by clear understanding of objective and consequence. "You offer me everything I once thought I wanted," Magnus said, as the battle reached its climax. "Yet you offer nothing I actually need. Power that serves only itself is not strength, but weakness. Knowledge that destroys understanding is not wisdom, but folly." The final exchange was brief but decisive. The demon Magnus denied the corruption it had been created to facilitate, found its existence becoming increasingly unstable, as the contradictions inherent in its nature began to tear it apart. With a scream of rage and frustration that echoed through dimensions beyond counting, it dissipated into nothingness, leaving behind only the acrid scent of possibilities that would never be fulfilled. Magnus emerged from the confrontation, changed yet again, his psychic abilities refined by the trial he had endured. The Emperor watched with satisfaction as his son took his place at the Webway's defensive controls, his consciousness extending through the network's pathways to establish barriers that the servants of chaos could not breach. "The network is secure," Magnus reported, his voice carrying notes of quiet satisfaction. "The daemon incursions have been contained and the pathways cleansed of corruption. Whatever other strategies our enemies might employ, they will not be able to use the Webway itself as a weapon against us." The victory was significant beyond its immediate tactical implications. The reunion of father and son, the restoration of trust that had seemed forever broken, and the demonstration that even the Chaos God's most carefully laid plans could be turned against them, all served to transform the psychological landscape of the conflict as much as its strategic balance. Word of Magnus's return spread through the loyal forces with a speed that defied conventional communication methods. The Space Marines who had witnessed their Primarch's disgrace at Nicaea now saw him restored to his father's favor, his powers employed not in defiance of imperial decree, but in service of the greater vision that had always guided the Emperor's actions. The message was clear. Redemption was possible. Forgiveness could be earned, and the bonds of loyalty were stronger than the whispers of corruption. For the Chaos Gods, watching from their realm of eternal torment, the implications were equally clear and infinitely more troubling. Their plan to corrupt and destroy the Emperor's greatest work had failed not merely tactically, but conceptually. The very foundations of their strategy, built upon the assumption that ambition and pride would inevitably lead to corruption, had been proven false by the example of a son who had chosen wisdom over power and service over self-aggrandizement. The Crimson King's redemption was complete, yet it represented more than the restoration of a single individual to the imperial fold. It embodied the possibility that even the greatest failures could be transformed into sources of strength, that the darkest moments of apparent defeat could become the foundation for ultimate victory. In the depths beneath Terra, where the Webway hummed with energies that connected the throne world to every corner of the galaxy, Magnus the Red took up his vigil alongside his father. The exile was ended, the wayward son had returned, and the war for humanity's future continued with renewed hope for the triumph of order over chaos. The demon self that had represented his potential fall lay destroyed, but the true self that had chosen redemption over damnation stood ready to defend everything he held sacred. The Red King had come home, and in his return lay proof that love could conquer corruption, that wisdom could triumph over ambition, and that the bonds between father and son were stronger than any force the galaxy could unleash against them. Chapter 9. The Shattered Legions Rise. The first sign that the balance of the war had shifted came not from the void battles raging above Terra, nor from the psychic confrontations that raged in dimensions beyond mortal perception, but from the impossible sight of dead men walking among the living. Through dimensional portals that materialized without warning across the rebel fleet's formation came warriors whose very existence challenged everything the traitors thought they understood about the conflict they had initiated. Ferrus Manus, the Gorgon, Primarch of the Iron Hands, stepped through a Webway gateway onto the bridge of the rebel cruiser Iron Blood with the inexorable presence of judgment given form. His silver hands gleamed in the chamber's harsh lighting, their mechanical perfection unmarred by the wounds that should have claimed his life on Istvan Fey's killing fields. Behind him came the survivors of his legion, warriors whose loyalty to the Emperor had marked them for death in the carefully orchestrated massacres that were intended to purge the Astartes of unreliable elements. The ship's crew stared in stunned disbelief at figures who had been reported dead for weeks, their presence so fundamentally impossible that minds struggled to process the evidence of their own senses. Yet there was nothing spectral or ethereal about these resurrected warriors. They moved with the same purposeful efficiency that had always marked their service, their bolters speaking with voices of righteous fury as they systematically eliminated every soul aboard the vessel who had chosen treachery over loyalty. Captain Durak Rask, who had led the Ironblood's crew in their declaration for the War Master, found himself face to face with the Gene Father, whose death he had celebrated as liberation from imperial tyranny. The words of defiance that had seemed so righteous only moments before, died in his throat as he confronted the terrible reality of survival beyond apparent death. "Impossible," he whispered, his augmented vocal cords barely able to form the words. "You died on Istvan Fi. I saw the picked captures of your body being brought before Horus himself." Ferrus Manus regarded his wayward son with eyes that reflected the cold fury of betrayed expectations. "What you saw was what our enemies were meant to see, what they expected to witness. Our father's foresight extends beyond the comprehension of those who mistake treachery for wisdom." The explanation that followed revealed the true scope of the Emperor's preparation for this moment. The massacres on Istvan III and Istvan V had proceeded according to their architects' carefully laid plans, yet the Emperor's agents had been positioned to extract the loyalist elements from both conflicts before their destruction could be completed. The Webway portals that materialized during the chaos of battle had gone undetected by enemies whose attention was focused upon the slaughter they believed they were conducting. Thousands of Space Marines who should have died as martyrs to their loyalty had instead been preserved to serve as instruments of justice when the moment of reckoning arrived. Their apparent deaths had served a double purpose, convincing the traitors that their purges had been successful, while providing the Emperor with strike forces whose very existence would shatter enemy morale when they were finally revealed. Across the rebel fleet, similar scenes of impossible resurrection began to unfold, as more Webway portals disgorged warriors whose survival challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which the rebellion had been based. Corax of the Raven Guard materialized aboard the battle barge, spectre of death like a shadow given deadly purpose, his presence preceded by the systematic failure of the ship's lighting and communication systems, as his legions, masters of stealth warfare, demonstrated capabilities that transcended conventional understanding. The rebels who had claimed the vessel in the name of the War Master found themselves hunted through their own corridors by enemies who seemed to exist in the spaces between darkness and light. The Raven Guard struck without warning and vanished without trace, their assaults coordinated with a precision that spoke to abilities refined by suffering into instruments of perfect retribution. Vulcan's return was heralded by the sudden appearance of flame that burned without consuming, fire that purified rather than destroyed. The Drake emerged through a portal that opened in the very heart of the rebel supply convoy, his massive frame wreathed in energies that seemed to draw their power from humanity's collective will to survive. The salamanders who followed him moved with the implacable determination of craftsmen completing a work of supreme importance, their flamers and melter weapons turning traitor vessels into funeral pyres that would burn for generations in the void. Yet it was not merely the tactical advantage of surprise that made these resurrections so devastating to rebel morale, but the psychological implications of their very existence. The traitors had justified their rebellion in part through the belief that the Emperor's callous disregard for his servants had driven them to seek new masters who would value their service. The revelation that their father had preserved the lives of those loyal to him while allowing the treacherous to believe themselves successful in their purges shattered this rationalization beyond all hope of repair. Commander Erebus, observing the unfolding disaster from his position aboard the word-bearer's vessel, Infidus Imperator, felt the cold touch of genuine fear as reports reached him of the impossible resurrections that were systematically dismantling the rebel fleet's effectiveness. The Dark Apostle's communion with the ruinous powers had granted him insights into the deeper currents of reality, yet nothing in his understanding had prepared him for the possibility that the Emperor's foresight could extend to the preservation of souls that should have been claimed by death itself. "The dead do not return without cause," he murmured to his assembled acolytes, his voice carrying harmonics of uncertainty that would have been unthinkable in the confident orator who had orchestrated so much of the rebellion's ideological foundation. If our enemies possess the power to defeat death itself, then our understanding of this conflict has been fundamentally flawed from its inception. The communications that reached the word-bearer's vessel painted a picture of systematic disaster that transcended mere tactical defeat. The Iron Hands had not simply survived their apparent destruction, but had been preserved in fighting strength sufficient to mount coordinated assaults against multiple rebel vessels simultaneously. The Raven Guard demonstrated stealth capabilities that allowed them to penetrate supposedly secure formations and strike at targets that should have been beyond their reach. The Salamanders deployed with the coordination and precision that could only have been achieved through months of careful preparation. Most disturbing of all, the Loyalist forces displayed a unity of purpose and coordination that suggested access to communication methods that transcended the limitations of conventional Vox arrays. Their strikes were timed with mathematical precision, their targets chosen with intelligence that could only have come from sources positioned at the highest levels of rebel command structure. The very security measures that the traitors had implemented to protect their operations from Imperial infiltration seemed to have been anticipated and countered before they could be deployed. It was Corvus Corax who provided the explanation that transformed confusion into understanding. His words carried across the void through means that bypassed every defensive measure the rebels had implemented to secure their communications. The Raven Guard Primarch's voice emerged from the very walls of traitor vessels, his presence manifesting through technologies that seemed to treat physical barriers as mere inconveniences rather than absolute limitations. You believed that death would silence our voices, and that treachery would grant you victory through surprise, Corax spoke, his words echoing through rebel command centers with the authority of judgment pronounced from beyond the grave. Yet our father's wisdom exceeded your understanding, just as his love for humanity transcends your capacity for betrayal. The revelation that followed struck at the very heart of the rebels' understanding of their situation. The Webway network that the Emperor had constructed did not merely allow for instantaneous transportation between distant points in space, but provided a means for preserving the essential essence of those who traveled within its protective embrace. The Loyalist Primarchs and their warriors had not merely survived their apparent deaths through conventional rescue operations, but had been preserved through methods that touched upon the deepest mysteries of consciousness and identity. Their souls, their memories, their essential nature as servants of humanity's future, had been stored within the crystalline matrices of the Webway itself during the moments of their apparent destruction. The bodies that now fought against the rebel fleet were not merely flesh and bone preserved from physical death, but complete beings restored through the application of technologies that bridged the gap between the material and immaterial realms. The implications staggered even those who understood the theoretical principles involved. If the Emperor possessed the capability to preserve and restore the essential nature of his servants, then death itself became merely another weapon in his arsenal, rather than an absolute limitation on his resources. The Loyalist forces did not merely fight with the knowledge that their service would be remembered and honored, but with the certainty that their sacrifice would not represent an ending, but a transformation into something greater. For the rebel forces, this revelation transformed their entire understanding of the conflict they had chosen to join. The war they had believed would be decided by conventional measures of military superiority had instead become a contest between finite resources and infinite possibilities. Their enemies possessed not merely superior preparation and strategic positioning, but access to capabilities that transcended the basic assumptions upon which military planning had always been based. The morale collapse that followed was swift and devastating in its scope. Units that had fought with fanatical determination in service of their new masters began to question whether their rebellion served any purpose beyond feeding their own damnation. Officers who had justified their treachery through appeals to necessity and survival found themselves confronting the evidence that their father's love extended even beyond death itself for those who remained true to his vision. Captain Loken, observing the systematic destruction of rebel formations from his position aboard the Vengeful Spirit, felt the weight of terrible understanding settling upon his consciousness. The rebellion that had seemed so righteous and necessary only weeks before now revealed itself as little more than an elaborate test, a trial that separated those capable of remaining loyal under pressure from those whose dedication was contingent upon personal advantage. "My lord," he addressed Horus with the formal courtesy that had always marked their relationship, yet his words carried undertones of doubt that would have been unthinkable before this moment. "Perhaps we should consider whether our current course serves the greater good of humanity. If our father possesses such capabilities, then surely his vision for our species exceeds our current understanding." The War Master's response was swift and terrible, his corruption blazing forth in fury that sent lesser beings cowering in terror. Yet beneath that rage lay the cold recognition that his rebellion was failing, not merely tactically, but conceptually. The Emperor had not simply prepared to defend against treachery, but had transformed the very nature of service and sacrifice into weapons that his enemies could not hope to counter. The battle that had begun as a siege intended to seize terror through surprise and superior force had instead become a demonstration of the futility of rebellion against a father whose love for his children extended beyond death itself. The shattered legions had risen not as vengeful spirits seeking retribution, but as living proof that loyalty to humanity's future was rewarded with possibilities that transcended mortal understanding. In the depths of space, where the rebel fleet continued its increasingly desperate assault upon Terra's defenses, the resurrection of the dead had become a reality that no amount of denial could dismiss. The Iron Hands fought with mechanical precision that had been refined by their experience of preservation and restoration. The Raven Guard struck from shadows that seemed to exist in dimensions beyond conventional space. The Salamanders brought cleansing fire that burned away not merely physical corruption, but the spiritual taint that had driven their enemies to choose treachery over truth. The war for humanity's future continued, but its outcome was no longer in doubt. The dead had risen to defend the living, and in their resurrection lay proof that the Emperor's vision for his species encompassed possibilities that even the Chaos Gods themselves had failed to anticipate. The shattered legions had been reforged into instruments of justice, and through their service, the galaxy would learn that some bonds were stronger than death itself. Chapter 10. The Daemon's Last Gambit. In the deepest places of the warp, where the screams of the damned had echoed for eons uncounted, and the laughter of dark gods had shaped the very fabric of reality through will alone, something unprecedented was taking place. The four ruinous powers, entities whose existence had been defined by eternal competition and mutual antipathy, were setting aside their differences in service of a singular purpose that transcended their individual natures. For the first time since the war in heaven had torn the galaxy apart, Khorne, Tzeentch, Nurgle, and Slaanesh acted with unified intent. The threat that had driven them to this unprecedented cooperation was unlike anything they had faced in the countless millennia since their ascension to godhood. Humanity's completion of the Webway project represented not merely another challenge to their influence, but an existential threat to their very existence. If mortals could sever their connection to the warp entirely, if consciousness could develop and flourish without feeding the hunger that sustained the dark powers, then the gods themselves faced a fate worse than death: irrelevance. The assault they launched against the Imperial Webway began not with the crude application of brute force, but with subtleties that reflected the collective cunning of beings whose understanding of reality's deeper currents had been refined across eons of manipulation and corruption. They struck simultaneously across multiple dimensions, their attack coordinated with a precision that would have impressed even the Emperor himself had he not been fully occupied with the defense of his greatest achievement. Khorne's rage manifested as waves of pure aggression that sought to overwhelm the network's defensive systems through the simple expedient of presenting more targets than any defense could possibly address. Legions of bloodthirsty demons materialized within the Webway's corridors, their existence sustained by the fury of every act of violence that had ever been committed in the galaxy's blood-soaked history. They brought with them not merely the desire to destroy, but the fundamental concept of destruction itself, seeking to corrupt the pathways with the understanding that all things must end in violence and suffering. Tzeentch's contribution was more subtle, but infinitely more dangerous. The architect of fate wove patterns of change and mutation into the very structure of the Webway itself, seeking to transform the network from a tool of humanity's salvation into an instrument of their damnation. Reality twisted and flowed under his influence, the crystalline walls of the passages taking on new configurations that led not to distant stars, but to realms where hope died and madness reigned supreme. Nurgle's gifts spread through the network like a plague that infected not merely living tissue, but the concept of existence itself. His demons brought with them the certainty of decay, the knowledge that all achievements must crumble, and all dreams must rot into nightmare. They sought to corrupt the Webway not through destruction, but through transformation, changing its purpose from preservation to putrefaction, from sanctuary to sepulchre. Slanesh's assault was perhaps the most insidious of all, for it struck not at the network's physical structure, but at the will of those who sought to defend it. The Prince of Pleasure sent forth temptations so profound and terrible that even the most disciplined minds struggled to resist their allure. The demon things that emerged from his realm whispered promises of sensation beyond imagination, experiences that would make the simple act of existence feel like paradise beyond description. Against this unprecedented assault, the defenders of humanity's future marshaled every resource at their disposal. In the depths beneath the Imperial Palace, the Emperor sat upon the golden throne with his consciousness expanded across dimensions that existed beyond mortal comprehension. His will became the primary anchor that held the network's human sections in stable existence, his understanding of reality's deeper patterns allowing him to counter the gods' manipulations with surgical precision. Beside him, Malkador the Sigillite channeled the collective psychic potential of humanity itself through mechanisms that had been prepared for this exact moment. The Sigillite's consciousness reached out across the galaxy, touching the minds of every psyker whose loyalty to the Imperial vision remained unshakable. Through his coordination, their individual abilities were woven together into a tapestry of power that rivaled the gods themselves in scope and intensity. Magnus the Red stood at the network's primary defensive matrix, his understanding of both chaos sorcery and protective warding, allowing him to perceive the true nature of the assault with a clarity that even his father's enhanced senses could not match. The Red King's powers, refined by suffering and tempered by wisdom, became the surgical instrument that excised corruption from the pathways, even as it sought to take root. They seek to transform the network's fundamental purpose, Magnus reported, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated across multiple dimensions simultaneously. This is not merely an invasion, but an attempt at conceptual reconstruction. They would make our greatest achievement into their most effective weapon. The Emperor's response came not through words, but through direct transfer of understanding that encompassed strategies beyond the scope of conventional thought. The defense that unfolded was conducted not merely in the physical realm, or even in the familiar dimensions of the warp, but across planes of existence where cause and effect operated according to principles that mortal minds could barely grasp. On Terra itself, the battle manifested as phenomena that challenged every assumption about the nature of reality. The Imperial Palace became a nexus where multiple dimensions intersected, its corridors existing simultaneously in the material realm and in spaces that belonged to neither matter nor energy, but something that partook of both. Custodians fought demon hordes in battles that were conducted across time as well as space, their guardian spears striking at enemies whose existence spanned past, present, and future simultaneously. Yet it was not merely on Terra that the conflict raged, but across the entire galaxy as human psychers responded to Malkador's call with a unity that transcended political boundaries and personal loyalties. On distant worlds where the Great Crusade had brought compliance, astropaths and sanctioned psychers joined their will to the great working that sought to preserve humanity's future. In the depths of space, where Imperial expeditions continued their missions of exploration and conquest, navigators and battle psychers contributed their strength to a collective effort that spanned light years. The response was not limited to those who served the Imperium directly. On feral worlds where human populations had regressed to barbarism during the Age of Strife, tribal shamans felt the call and added their primitive understanding of the great ocean's currents to the greater working. In the industrial hives of Forge worlds, tech adepts whose augmented consciousness had been enhanced with psychic implants channeled their mechanical precision into patterns of thought that supported the network's integrity. Most remarkably, even on worlds that had not yet been brought into imperial compliance, human psychers whose existence was unknown to any authority felt the summons and responded with an instinctive understanding that their species' future hung in the balance. The collective will of humanity revealed itself as a force of such magnitude that even the Chaos Gods themselves paused in their assault, recognizing that they faced not merely the opposition of trained warriors, but the unified determination of an entire species. The psychic battles that resulted were conducted across dimensions that existed beyond conventional description. Magnus found himself dueling with aspects of Tsinch that manifested as living equations seeking to rewrite the fundamental laws of mathematics. The Emperor engaged Khorne in contests of will, where victory and defeat were measured, not in blood spilled, but in principles upheld against the pressure of infinite rage. Malkador wove defenses against Nurgle's corruption that took the form of concepts so pure and untainted that they burned through the miasma of decay like stars igniting in the heart of dying nebulae. Across the galaxy, human psychers joined their strength to his, their combined will manifesting as barriers of crystallized hope that held back the tide of despair and entropy. The assault reached its climax when the four gods attempted to coordinate their individual attacks into a single overwhelming blow that would shatter the network's defenses through the simple expedient of presenting more complexity than any mind could possibly process. They sought to corrupt every pathway simultaneously, to transform every defensive measure into a weapon turned against its creators, to make the very concept of resistance into another form of service to their will. It was then that humanity's true potential revealed itself. The Psykers who had answered Malcador's call did not merely contribute their individual strength to the collective defense, but began to exhibit capabilities that transcended anything previously recorded in the species' history. Their consciousness merged not merely in coordination, but in actual unity, creating collective intelligences that possessed problem-solving capabilities far beyond what any individual mind could achieve. These merged entities thought with the clarity of pure mathematics and acted with the precision of fundamental forces. They did not fight the gods' assault so much as they solved it, treating each attack as a puzzle to be unraveled rather than a threat to be resisted. Where chaos sought to impose irrationality, the unified human consciousness responded with logic so pure that contradiction became impossible. Where corruption attempted to take root, understanding burned it away with the simple recognition of what it actually was rather than what it pretended to be. The turning point came when the collective human will began to push back against the gods themselves, forcing them to defend their own realm rather than continue their assault upon the Webway. The unified consciousness that humanity had achieved through its response to the crisis proved capable of reaching into the warp itself, treating the domain of the gods not as an inviolable sanctuary, but as simply another dimension to be explored and understood. "Impossible," whispered Tzeentch, the architect of fate for the first time in eons, finding himself confronted by changes that he had not anticipated or planned. "Unacceptable," raged Khorne, discovering that his fury could be analyzed and dissected until it became merely another form of energy to be channeled and controlled. "Unprecedented," groaned Nurgle, watching as the corruption he spread was metabolized and transformed into new forms of vitality and growth. "Unthinkable," gasped Slaanesh, realizing that the sensations being experienced by the unified human consciousness were so far beyond anything he could offer that his temptations seemed pale and insignificant by comparison. The gods found themselves forced to withdraw from their assault, not because they lacked the power to continue, but because continuing would risk their own existence. The unified human will had demonstrated capabilities that threatened to subsume their individual natures into something greater and more complex than any of them could comprehend. As the last of the demonic incursions was cleansed from the Webway's corridors, the Emperor rose from the Golden Throne to survey what humanity had achieved through its response to ultimate crisis. The network remained intact, its pathways purified and strengthened by the trial they had endured. Yet more significantly, the species had demonstrated a capacity for unity and coordination that transformed their potential for future development beyond all previous calculation. "They have shown us what they are capable of becoming," Magnus observed, his consciousness still resonating with the collective will that had turned back the gods themselves. "Indeed," the Emperor replied, his ancient eyes reflecting satisfaction, tempered by the understanding of what such capabilities would require. The next phase of their evolution has begun, not through gradual development, but through the crucible of ultimate necessity. They have become something new, something that even I didn't dare to hope they might achieve. The demon's last gambit had failed, but in its failure it had catalyzed transformations that would reshape the galaxy itself. Humanity had faced the ultimate test of its worthiness to transcend the limitations that had constrained conscious life since its inception, and in that testing had revealed capabilities that even the gods feared to challenge. The war was far from over, but its outcome was no longer in doubt. Humanity had unified in ways that transcended individual consciousness, and in that unity lay the foundation for achievements that would eclipse anything the galaxy had previously witnessed. The gods had gambled everything on a single decisive assault, and in their defeat had inadvertently catalyzed the very transformation they had sought to prevent. The species they had attempted to corrupt and control had instead become something that existed beyond their reach, unified in purpose and unlimited in potential. The demon's gambit was ended, and humanity's ascension had begun. Chapter 11. The Golden Age dawns. The silence that followed the gods' retreat was not the hollow emptiness of defeat, but the profound quiet that comes when a storm has passed and the world begins to heal. In the void above Terra, where the rebel fleet had expected to find victory through treachery and surprise, Horus Lupercal stood upon the bridge of the vengeful spirit and felt the weight of absolute abandonment settling upon his shoulders like a shroud woven from his own betrayals. The voices that had whispered promises of power and glory had fallen silent, their seductive words replaced by the terrible clarity of understanding. The Chaos Gods, faced with their own potential extinction at the hands of humanity's unified will, had withdrawn their support with the casual indifference of gamblers abandoning a losing proposition. The corruption that had sustained Horus through months of rebellion now felt like poison in his veins, its dark gifts revealed as chains that bound him to masters who cared nothing for his welfare or that of any mortal being. For the first time since his fall on Davin's moon, the War Master saw himself with perfect clarity. He beheld the path he had chosen, not as liberation from tyranny, but as willing enslavement to entities whose existence depended upon the suffering of others. The rebellion he had led was not a righteous uprising against an uncaring father, but a tool wielded by powers that viewed all conscious life as nothing more than sustenance for their endless hunger. The communication that reached him came not through the usual channels of military transmission, but through means that bypassed every defensive measure his ship possessed. His father's voice emerged from the very air itself, carrying with it harmonics of authority, tempered by something that Horus had never expected to hear again. Love. "My son," the Emperor said, his words resonating through the bridge with the weight of absolute truth. "The choice remains before you, as it always has. You may continue upon the path that leads only to damnation and despair, or you may seek redemption through service to something greater than your own ambitions." Horus found himself unable to respond immediately, his throat constricted by emotions that he had thought the corruption had burned away. Around him, the bridge crew waited in silence for orders that he could not bring himself to give. The weapons that could still rain destruction upon Terra's surface remained ready for deployment, yet their use would serve no purpose beyond adding to the galaxy's already immeasurable store of suffering. "I have seen what lies at the end of the road I have traveled," Horus finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. "I have witnessed the true nature of the powers I chose to serve, and I understand now that they offer nothing but the illusion of strength purchased with the currency of souls. If there is still a place for me in your vision for humanity's future, then I surrender myself to your judgment." The response came not in words, but in action that demonstrated the true scope of the Emperor's preparation for this moment. Webway portals materialized throughout the rebel fleet, disgorging not strike forces intent on destruction, but teams of the finest healers, tech adepts and psychic counselors that the Imperium could provide. They came not as conquerors seeking to humiliate the defeated, but as physicians whose purpose was to heal wounds that extended far deeper than the merely physical. The corruption that had claimed so many of the rebellion's participants proved resistant to conventional treatment. Yet the Emperor's servants had prepared for this challenge with the same thoroughness that had marked every aspect of their resistance to chaos. Working with knowledge gleaned from Magnus's understanding of both sorcery and purification, they began the delicate process of excising taint without destroying the essential nature of those they sought to save. Horus himself was brought to Terra not as a prisoner, but as a patient whose condition required the personal attention of the galaxy's greatest healer. In the depths of the Imperial Palace, where the golden throne hummed with energies that bridged the material and immaterial realms, the Emperor undertook the careful work of separating his son's essential nature from the corruption that had claimed it. The process was neither swift nor simple, requiring months of painstaking effort to undo damage that had been inflicted not merely upon Horus's physical form, but upon the very foundation of his identity. Yet the Emperor worked with the patience of one who had always known that this moment would come, his love for his son proving stronger than any force the Chaos Gods could marshal against it. As Horus healed, the greater work of humanity's transformation began to unfold across the galaxy. The unified consciousness that had emerged during the crisis with the Chaos Gods proved to be not a temporary phenomenon, born of desperation, but the first manifestation of humanity's true potential, finally given expression. Within the protected environments of Webway-connected worlds, the species began to develop abilities that had previously been the province of only the most gifted individuals. The first generation of children born within these sanctuaries exhibited psychic capabilities that surpassed anything in recorded history. Yet their abilities remained perfectly controlled and free from the taint of corruption that had plagued human psyches since the species first developed consciousness. They could perceive the emotional states of others with perfect clarity, yet used this knowledge not to manipulate, but to foster understanding and empathy. They could influence matter at the molecular level through focused will, yet employed these gifts not for personal aggrandizement, but in service of the collective good. More significantly, these new humans demonstrated the ability to link their consciousness with others of their kind, creating collective intelligences that could solve problems and process information at rates that approached the capabilities of the Emperor himself. They thought not as individuals pursuing separate goals, but as facets of a greater mind dedicated to the advancement of their species and the spread of order throughout the galaxy. The technological implications of these developments were staggering in their scope. The merger of psychic ability with scientific understanding produced innovations that transcended anything achieved by previous galactic civilizations. Machines that responded to thought rather than physical manipulation began to appear in workshops across the Imperium. Starships that could navigate the galaxy through the combined will of their crews rather than the dangerous currents of the warp revolutionized interstellar travel even beyond the capabilities provided by the Webway itself. Medical techniques that addressed not merely physical ailments, but the psychological and spiritual wounds that had accumulated during humanity's long struggle for survival began to heal damage that had persisted since the Age of Strife. Agricultural methods that enhanced productivity through the direct application of psychic energy to growing processes promised to eliminate want and hunger from every world in the Imperium. Yet perhaps the most remarkable achievement was the development of educational systems that transmitted knowledge not through the laborious process of study and memorization, but through direct consciousness-to-consciousness transfer. Children could master in days what had previously required years of instruction, their enhanced abilities allowing them to absorb not merely information, but understanding itself. The implications for governance were equally revolutionary. The collective consciousness that had emerged among humanity's psychic population made deception and corruption virtually impossible to maintain. Planetary governors who sought to enrich themselves at their subjects' expense found their intentions exposed before they could act upon them. Military commanders who allowed personal ambition to override their duty to the Imperium discovered that their true motivations were transparent to those they sought to lead. This transformation was not imposed from above, but grew organically from humanity's enhanced capacity for empathy and understanding. The species began to govern itself not through the application of external authority, but through the collective will of individuals who understood their interconnectedness with others. Laws became unnecessary when every citizen could perceive the consequences of their actions upon the well-being of the whole. The Imperium that emerged from this transformation retained its essential character as a force for order and progress in the galaxy. Yet its methods and objectives evolved to match humanity's enhanced capabilities. Rather than bringing compliance through conquest, Imperial expeditions now offered other species the opportunity to join a civilization that had transcended the limitations that had constrained conscious life since its inception. Some races welcomed this invitation, recognizing in humanity's achievement the fulfillment of aspirations that their own species had long cherished but never achieved. The Eldar, whose empire had fallen to the excesses of uncontrolled psychic development, watched with wonder as humanity navigated the very dangers that had destroyed their civilization. The Tau, with their philosophy of collective advancement, found much to admire in humanity's new emphasis on unity and cooperation. Others resisted, whether through fear of change or dedication to their own visions of galactic order. Yet even these holdouts found their opposition increasingly futile as humanity's enhanced abilities made conventional military conflict obsolete. Wars were won not through the application of superior force, but through the simple demonstration of what life could become when consciousness was liberated from the constraints of individual limitation. The Orc empires, sustained by their love of conflict for its own sake, found their warlike nature gradually pacified through exposure to human psychers whose abilities could perceive and address the underlying drives that motivated aggressive behavior. The Tyranid hive fleets, seeking to consume all organic matter in their path, were met not with desperate resistance, but with understanding that addressed their hunger at its source. Even the Necron dynasties, awakening from their great sleep to find the galaxy transformed beyond recognition, discovered that their ancient grievances seemed petty and obsolete when measured against the possibilities that humanity's achievement represented. Some chose to continue their campaigns of conquest out of simple habit, yet others began to explore whether their mechanical existence might be enhanced through contact with a species that had mastered the integration of consciousness and technology. Throughout this transformation, the Emperor walked among his people, not as a distant ruler upon a golden throne, but as a teacher and guide whose presence inspired rather than commanded. The golden throne itself was modified to serve new purposes, becoming not merely an anchor for the Webway's stability, but a hub through which the collective consciousness of humanity could coordinate its activities across the galaxy. Magnus the Red stood beside his father in this work, his understanding of both sorcery and science proving invaluable in the development of techniques that could enhance human psychic potential without the risks that had claimed so many previous attempts at such advancement. The Red King's redemption had become complete not through the erasure of his past mistakes, but through their transformation into sources of wisdom that guided humanity away from the pitfalls that had trapped other species. Malcador the Sigillite, his role as regent of the Imperium, evolved to match the changing nature of the civilization he served, coordinated the vast networks of communication and cooperation that allowed humanity's scattered populations to function as a unified whole despite being spread across thousands of star systems. His ancient wisdom proved invaluable in managing the transition from a species constrained by individual limitations to one that could act with genuine collective intelligence. As the years passed and the transformation deepened, it became clear that humanity was approaching a threshold that would carry them beyond even the Emperor's most ambitious visions. The species that had once struggled for survival in the hostile galaxy was becoming something that transcended the very concepts of limitation and mortality. They were achieving not merely dominance over the material realm, but mastery of the forces that shaped consciousness itself. The Golden Age that dawned was unlike anything the galaxy had witnessed since the legendary heights of the Eldar Empire, yet it was built upon foundations that promised greater permanence and stability. Where the Eldar had pursued individual excellence and personal fulfillment, humanity sought collective advancement and mutual understanding. Where previous civilizations had eventually fallen to their own excesses or external pressures, humanity's enhanced consciousness provided constant self-correction and adaptation. The future stretched ahead like a pathway of crystallized starlight, leading toward possibilities that even the Emperor's ancient imagination could barely encompass. Humanity had achieved the first phase of its destined evolution, yet this was merely the beginning of a journey that would ultimately carry consciousness itself beyond the limitations that had constrained it since the universe's formation. The Golden Age had dawned, and with its arrival came the promise that the darkness, which had plagued the galaxy for so long, was finally beginning to give way to light. Chapter 12. The Eternal Dream. 1,000 years had passed since the moment when humanity first walked the golden path that would carry them beyond the reach of gods and demons. Yet for the Emperor of mankind, those centuries felt like the drawing of a single breath in the vast span of his existence. He stood now not upon the golden throne, but upon the highest balcony of the transformed imperial palace, his ancient eyes surveying a galaxy that bore little resemblance to the war-torn realm he had once sought to unite through conquest and compliance. The terror that spread below him was no longer the scarred husk of humanity's birth world, its surface poisoned by millennia of industrial excess and environmental collapse. The collective will of his evolved children had healed wounds that conventional terraforming could never have addressed, restoring seas that sparkled with clarity unknown since the planet's youth and forests that grew not according to natural selection, but in accordance with designs that maximized both beauty and ecological harmony. Yet it was not merely terror that had been transformed, but every world that humanity had touched in their expansion through the galaxy. The Webway network that had once been his greatest achievement now served as the foundation for something far more magnificent. A civilization that spread not through the crude mechanics of conquest and subjugation, but through the irresistible appeal of consciousness liberated from limitation. The Emperor's awareness extended through the network's pathways, touching the minds of his children as they pursued their work of enlightenment across the stars. On distant worlds where once the Great Crusade had brought compliance through fire and sword, human colonists now offered other species the opportunity to join in the collective ascension that had become their species' defining characteristic. Some worlds welcomed this invitation with a gratitude that bordered on worship. The Tau, whose philosophy of the greater good had always aligned with humanity's enhanced understanding of collective purpose, had integrated so thoroughly with the expanding human consciousness that the distinction between the two species had become largely academic. Their technology and humanity's psychic abilities had merged into achievements that surpassed anything either civilization could have accomplished in isolation. The Eldar, those ancient inheritors of a fallen empire, watched humanity's progress with emotions too complex for lesser minds to comprehend. In the species they had once dismissed as crude barbarians, they now recognized the fulfillment of aspirations their own people had abandoned as impossible. Some among them had chosen to join the great work, contributing their understanding of psychic manipulation and dimensional engineering to projects that promised to reshape the fundamental nature of reality itself. Even the orcs, those seemingly irredeemable devotees of endless warfare, had found their nature transformed through contact with human psychers whose abilities could perceive and address the underlying drives that motivated their aggressive behavior. Their love of conflict had been channeled into competitive endeavors that satisfied their need for challenge without the destructive consequences that had once made them a plague upon the galaxy. Yet not all species had chosen the path of cooperation and integration. In the deepest reaches of space, where light from Sol had never traveled, ancient powers stirred with growing unease at the transformation that was spreading through what they had always considered their domain. The Necron dynasties, awakening from the great sleep to find their galaxy fundamentally altered, responded with the mechanical fury of beings whose very existence had been predicated upon the dominance of entropy over order. Some wars still raged, though their character had evolved beyond anything that previous generations would have recognized as warfare. Conflicts were conducted, not merely in the material realm, but across dimensions that existed beyond conventional perception, with victory determined not by the destruction of enemies, but by the transformation of their understanding. Humanity's enhanced consciousness proved capable of reaching even the most alien minds, offering redemption and integration where previous ages would have known only annihilation. The Tyrannid hive fleets, those cosmic locusts that sought to consume all biological matter in their path, presented a different sort of challenge. Their hunger was not born of malice or ignorance, but represented a fundamental aspect of their nature that could not be reasoned with or reformed. Yet even here, humanity's enhanced abilities had found solutions that transcended conventional military responses. The collective consciousness that linked all human minds proved capable of perceiving the deeper patterns that guided Tyrannid behavior, allowing for interventions that redirected their hunger toward purposes that served the greater cosmic order. The Emperor reflected upon these achievements with satisfaction, tempered by the understanding that they represented only the beginning of humanity's true potential. The species that had once struggled for survival in a hostile galaxy had become the galaxy's gardeners, cultivating consciousness wherever it appeared, and nurturing its development toward forms that transcended individual limitation. Yet even as he contemplated these triumphs, the Emperor's enhanced perception detected currents of change that spoke to challenges yet to come. Beyond the galaxy's edge, in the vast darkness between stellar formations, ancient entities stirred with awareness of the transformation taking place within the spiral arms they had long ignored. These were beings whose existence spanned cosmological ages, consciousnesses so vast and alien that even the chaos gods seemed like mere children by comparison. The expansion of human consciousness through the galaxy had created ripple effects that propagated far beyond the boundaries of local space-time, attracting the attention of powers that measured their thoughts in the lifespans of stars and their ambitions in the birth and death of entire galactic clusters. Some among these cosmic entities viewed humanity's achievement with approval, recognizing in it the fulfillment of purposes that they had set in motion eons before the first human had learned to make fire. Others saw in humanity's transcendence a threat to orders of existence that had remained stable since the universe's formation. The collective consciousness that linked human minds across the galaxy represented a form of organization that could potentially challenge the fundamental structures upon which cosmic reality itself was built. "Father," came a voice that resonated through both sound and psychic space, drawing the Emperor's attention back to the immediate present. He turned to behold Magnus the Red, though the being who approached bore little resemblance to the tragic figure who had once been known as the Crimson King of Prospero. The 1,000 years of humanity's golden age had transformed the Primarch into something that transcended his original nature while retaining the essential characteristics that had always defined him. His form shifted between physical manifestation and pure consciousness as his attention moved between the material realm and the deeper dimensions where the species' true work was conducted. The Council of Minds has reached a consensus regarding the expansion beyond the galactic rim, Magnus reported, his communication carrying layers of meaning that would have required hours to express through conventional language. The pathways we have detected leading to neighboring galaxies appear stable enough to support permanent transit, yet the entities we have contacted on the far side express reservations about our presence. The Emperor nodded, his ancient understanding encompassing implications that reached far beyond the immediate tactical concerns. Humanity's expansion through their home galaxy had been facilitated by the fact that most of the species they encountered operated according to principles that could be understood and addressed through enhanced consciousness. Yet the entities that dwelt in the vast spaces between galaxies represented forms of existence so fundamentally different that communication itself became a challenge, requiring careful preparation. "What manner of reservations?" he asked, though his consciousness was already extending through the network to examine the relevant data directly. "They question whether consciousness organized according to our principles can coexist with the cosmic orders they have established," Magnus replied. "Some appear willing to explore the possibilities for mutual understanding, yet others seem to view our expansion as an existential threat to forms of existence that have remained stable for billions of years." The conversation that followed was conducted not merely through words, but through direct consciousness-to-consciousness transfer that allowed for the sharing of complex concepts and emotional nuances with perfect clarity. The Emperor and his son examined the data that humanity's scouts had gathered from their initial contacts with extragalactic entities, analyzing patterns of response and communication that suggested the existence of civilizations whose scope and sophistication dwarfed even humanity's enhanced capabilities. "The eternal dream continues," the Emperor said finally, his words carrying resonances that acknowledged both the magnitude of humanity's achievements and the immensity of the challenges that lay ahead. "We have transformed ourselves from a species struggling for survival into gardeners of consciousness itself. Yet even this represents only the first step in a journey whose ultimate destination we can barely imagine." He moved to the balcony's edge, his gaze rising to encompass the star-filled void that stretched beyond Terra's atmosphere. In that darkness, his enhanced perception could detect the pathways that humanity had carved between galaxies, bridges of crystallized consciousness that would carry his children to realms where the very concept of individual existence might need to be redefined. "There will always be new frontiers," Magnus observed, joining his father at the balcony's edge. "Always new forms of consciousness to understand and integrate, always greater unities to achieve. Perhaps that is the true nature of existence itself, not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be explored through endless expansion of understanding." The Emperor's smile carried within it the satisfaction of a teacher whose greatest student had finally grasped the essential truth that underlay all learning. "Indeed, my son, The golden age we have built is not a destination, but a foundation. What we have achieved here will serve as the basis for transformations that even I cannot fully envision. They stood together in silence as Terra's rotation carried the balcony into the planet's shadow. Yet the darkness was not the empty void that had once seemed so hostile to human presence. The space between stars blazed with the light of consciousness itself, the network that connected human minds, creating patterns of illumination that turned the galaxy into a vast neural network, pulsing with thought and purpose. In the depths of that network, billions of human minds pursued their work of exploration and integration, each individual contributing to collective achievements that transcended anything their ancestors could have imagined. Children who had never known the fear of corruption or limitation explored realms of possibility that existed beyond the boundaries of conventional physics. Artists whose consciousness spanned star systems created works of beauty that incorporated entire worlds as components in compositions of cosmic scope. Scientists whose understanding had been enhanced by direct access to the collective knowledge of their species pursued research that addressed questions about the fundamental nature of reality itself. Engineers whose abilities combined psychic manipulation with technological precision constructed projects that spanned galactic distances and incorporated principles that treated space and time as malleable resources rather than absolute constraints. Yet perhaps most significantly, philosophers whose enhanced consciousness allowed them to perceive the deeper patterns that connected all existence worked to develop understanding of humanity's place in a universe whose scope and complexity had proven to be beyond even the Emperor's initial comprehension. What lies beyond even our current understanding? Magnus asked, his question reflecting the eternal curiosity that had always driven his pursuit of knowledge. The Emperor's response encompassed possibilities that stretched the boundaries of imagination itself. Perhaps the discovery that consciousness is not merely a property of living beings, but the fundamental force that gives structure to reality. Perhaps the understanding that what we call the universe is merely one note in a cosmic symphony, whose full scope extends across dimensions we have yet to perceive. He paused, his ancient awareness touching currents of possibility that flowed through realms beyond conventional description. Or perhaps something entirely beyond our current capacity to conceive, something that will require us to transcend not merely individual limitation, but the very concept of existence as we understand it. The conversation continued through the long hours of Terra's night, father and son exploring questions that had no answers, but whose contemplation served to expand understanding itself. Around them, the golden age that humanity had built continued its work of transformation and enlightenment, yet both understood that their greatest achievements lay not in what they had accomplished, but in what they had prepared themselves to become. As Terra's rotation brought the balcony back into sunlight, the Emperor gazed once more upon the galaxy that his children had claimed not through conquest, but through the irresistible appeal of consciousness liberated from limitation. The dream that had begun with a single species struggling for survival in a hostile universe had evolved into something that promised to reshape the very foundations of existence itself. Yet even as he contemplated these achievements, the Emperor's awareness remained focused upon the challenges that awaited them beyond the familiar boundaries of their home galaxy. In the vast darkness between stellar formations, ancient powers watched humanity's expansion with emotions ranging from curiosity to concern, to something that might have been fear in beings whose understanding spanned cosmological ages. The eternal dream continued, carrying consciousness itself toward destinations that even gods could not imagine. The golden path stretched ahead like a bridge built from crystallized starlight, leading toward possibilities that would either elevate existence to heights beyond current comprehension or reveal that some frontiers were not meant to be crossed by any form of life. But that was a consideration for the future. For now, there was work to be done, consciousness to nurture, and the endless mystery of existence to explore, one revelation at a time. The Emperor smiled as Terra's sun climbed toward its zenith, its light illuminating a world where humanity had learned to dream with their eyes open and make those dreams reality through the simple expedient of refusing to accept limitation as final. The eternal dream lived on, and through its continuation, the universe itself was becoming something greater than it had ever been before.